Wave if you're awake. Okay. Nice to see you this morning. Appreciate you getting up early to be here and join us. I want to thank the Sequan tribe last night for dinner. For those of you who are unable to join us, you missed some killer short ribs. I also want to start off with an introduction of somebody who probably doesn't need much of an introduction. There are a handful of champions in Indian country who work on behalf of children. I mean, he does other work as well for his tribe on other issues, but he's always responded to the call when somebody says Indian children need some help, whether it's one child in a particular case, or it's an issue that needs advocacy, or it's support in some other way. So to get us started in a good way this morning, I'm going to turn this over to Chairman Smith.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Judge. Good morning, everybody. I was asked to do the opening prayer. I traditionally don't do these because I feel I'm too young, but since there's nobody available, I'm the chairman. I'm happy to do it. And I'm going to do it in my language and I'll translate it. So, Copeño language from Paula. Miahwa, miahwanet, ainakikanesh, nabikahashakut, nachmapa kusa. Means welcome, enjoy your day, sit down and have a good day. So thank you. For years, it has enabled our communities to fight the well-being of our children and families, ripping children from their homes and communities in the name of assimilation of services are not just historical practice. To this day, Native children are continue to be unfairly targeted. My own family members have experienced the trauma involved with the devastating actions of state child welfare and adoption agencies' bias against Native children. I have personally seen the damage that can be done to the children, families, and the culture and sovereignty of our communities is neglected. Many tribes, including Paula, thrive in communal settings. Again, because of the work is personal to me and important to all of us, I served as one of the 6 tribal leaders, ICWA Compliance Task Force. I'd like to read an excerpt from the report that the task force presented to Attorney General Basara in March of 2017. It is the goal of the task force that this report be called to action. The rights of due process to political, cultural connections, and religious freedoms, and remain in one's community, the origin, are routinely under attack. To achieve and promise that ICWA, there must be more episodic rallying cries as well-meaning grant cycle initiatives. There must be a vigilant force that demands more than a lip service to compliance. Again, welcome and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. He's very modest about the accomplishments. I mean, he's chair of the California Tribal Families Coalition. They do some amazing work behind the scenes often in the legislature. California has the most progressive laws dealing with Indian children in the country. And we use them as an example when I teach around the country. Another organization that he chairs is Indian Health Council. Their tribal social service program 15 years ago had 487 kids in foster care. Last month they had 3. There are amazing things happening around Indian country, all in the shadow of Brackeen, because Brackeen can upend everything. But in the meantime, there are people who are working to create partnerships that 20 years ago, I would never have believed were possible, where we have state and tribal judges sitting together on cases, where we have states accepting the invitation of tribes to share resources that the tribe obtained through grants to help everybody in the community, tribal and non-tribal. We have examples of best practice that tribes are, in the words of Judge Abavanti, relearning, because we're not inventing it. As she said, remembering how we used to take care of each other, how we used to take care of the children, how we held our own relatives accountable and helped rather than judged. So as you're doing your work, remember that you're not alone. Sometimes it can feel very lonely. Feels like you're pushing a boulder up a hill. And just as you get to the almost to the top, you hit sand, and now you can't get your feet under you. Remember, you're not alone. If you keep going, somebody may appear next to you to help. Somebody may appear on the top of the hill to help pull that boulder up. But you're not alone, and most importantly, the kids will benefit. This is what we are about, is giving the kids the best start that we can. So I want to thank all of you for the work that you do. You don't get the spotlight very often. You don't get talked about very often. I want you to know that you're appreciated. You're appreciated by people who have to make those tough decisions. So I want to give you all a round of applause, please. Okay. I think we're going to ask the first panel to come up. It'll be just a moment before they're ready, but we'll ask them to come up.
Good morning. So first up this morning, we are going to hear from Director Nancy Bargeman from the California Department of Developmental Services. Director Bargeman has served as the director of DDS since 2016, but she started her career as a direct service provider, providing developmental services in Orange County. Please read more about her in the program book. We are very excited for this presentation and to hear an update from DDS. It's really, I think, the first time that we've had this kind of update at an ICWA conference, and it's a good primer for the event that we're hosting tomorrow in this same room. It's a free event that we are hosting in partnership with DDS and several regional centers around the country to start talking about how we can improve access for tribal communities to the developmental services that are available. So Director Bargeman, thank you for being here, and thank you to your team for being here as well.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I am very honored to be joining you today. And I am so looking forward to the opportunity tomorrow for the first conference really combining the developmental services with purpose of outreach and engagement with tribal communities. So today I get the great honor to be able to share with you about developmental services. And I actually started my timer because when I start talking about developmental services, I tend to ramble and go on and on and on. So I want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time today. So, but I also am really excited about sharing with you some really incredible initiatives that we have, but also opportunities to improve the outreach with purpose for our tribal communities and families across California. A little bit more about my background. I've been working with developmental services or within the developmental service system for just over 35 years. I did start as a direct service professional, but I also started working at a regional center back in the 80s. And I was at Inland Regional Center for San Bernardino Riverside counties for about 12 years. And then I worked as with a national provider organization providing services for all individuals, all ages with developmental disabilities, also with affordable housing. And I share that only because I want you to kind of get a sense of when we take a look at some of the major initiatives in really improving access to services for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that I really have this great benefit of being able to listen to our communities for so many years about what's important to them. But I'm also sad to say that even with all those years, that there's still things that we're missing. And I'm going to talk about that as to how we really need to make sure that we're focusing on engagement within our Native American communities in California. And extremely grateful to those advocates who recently brought it to our attention and being able to spotlight it. So again, with purpose, that we could really change that that challenge and make sure that we're correcting our pathway of making sure that we have outreach. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to walk you through. And I apologize to all of you that are really familiar with the regional center system, because I'm going to talk about kind of the basic services of what we are and what we do in California. So with the PowerPoint, I'm not sure who is going to be able to put that up for us. Oh, I do? Oh, okay. They're getting it. Oh, no worries. I wish I had a joke for you. So by raise of hands, if you don't mind, for those in the room, how many of you are really familiar with regional center services in California? If you'd say that you're really familiar. Excellent. Chairman Smith, thank you so much for being one of those champions. Really appreciate it. And then those that are looking forward to learning more about to help your families. Thank you. Okay, that helps be able to give some context where we get to start today. So while we're waiting, I'm going to give you some information. When we took a look at and Seasoned Good Pastures has been just amazing with raising the awareness of how we're not touching families that we really need to do outreach for within the Native American community. And right now we provide services. I'm going to show you that in our presentation here in a minute. In California, 377,000 individuals currently receive services within the regional center and developmental services system. We're projected to serve just about 400,000 individuals starting in January 2023. We're growing by the number of individuals eligible for services, which I'll go over that in a minute, by about 15 to 18,000 individuals per year. So of that, we have, so just putting a pin in that 377,000, currently we have 1,311 individuals that are identifying as Native American. That's 0.3% of our total consumer population. And I think we would all probably recognize that this is really an underserved representation of those in California that would be eligible for services. So again, I think by putting this as an awareness and the work that you all are doing is that I want to make sure that we're highlighting this item, because as an opportunity for accessing services, that we can get the word out and be able to bridge kind of those barriers to accessing services. So thank you for the posting the presentation. We're going to go to the first slide, the next slide. This is an organizational chart for California for developmental services. I wanted to give you an idea of where does the Department of Developmental Services fit within context of California. So the Governor's Office, California Health and Human Services, California Health and Human Services have a number of departments that are reporting directly to Cal CHS, and that includes Department of Social Services, Department of Public Health, Department of Healthcare Services, Department of Rehab, and as well as a number of other departments. And we are a part of the really great agency that is really leading the California efforts in accessing services. So as you'll see there, Department of Developmental Services, you can go ahead and see dotted lines going downward, which is for our state operated services. Just want to note that we do provide services directly as a state department. Several years ago, we closed all of our developmental centers. And what are those? They are the institutions that had been in operation many years. Oh, better. You didn't want to see our faces up there, did you? Thank you. So we had closed those developmental centers, and the last individual who moved from one of our state developmental centers who had an intellectual and developmental disability, they moved out of Fairview Developmental Center the first part of 2019. So, or actually the end of 2019. That was really a historical time in our delivery system, because that meant that we're leading into a community-based service delivery system. And that's really evident based on the history that we have. But we do still have a transition site that is called Canyon Springs in the lower desert. And then we provide acute crisis services in about 7 different community-based homes for individuals with highly complex needs. And then we have a crisis response team that we also operate at the state level. But then really the lion's share of our services are within the 21 regional centers throughout California. And when the regional center system was first envisioned, it was envisioned based on the advocacy of parents, very strong moms who said they wanted a different life for their family, for their children. And this was back in the late 60s and early 70s. The vision, the civil rights that are around this was very, very progressive, and really the voice and working with the legislature and really envisioning a different system. When the 21 regional centers after the pilot became into law, the 21 were actually around California, and it was established based on a population of the community of 1 million people. And in a minute, I'm going to show you the distribution of our population for services within developmental services with all the different regional centers and how the population and the distribution has changed over time. The intent is to make sure that each of the communities had a community-based system that was able to be responsive to the unique needs of those Californians within those areas. The 21 regional centers are private nonprofit organizations that have their own governing board. They have a contract with the state of California, which is the Department of Developmental Services. And then you'll see that there's a dotted line to service providers. Regional centers really are charged with working within their community and developing the services. You're going to hear us talk about service providers, vendors. That's really interchangeable because you have a service provider who's providing, say, early intervention service, respite, employment supports, residential supports. They are also called vendors because that's essentially the contract, to oversimplify, contract with the regional center and the mechanism for them to get paid for services that they're delivering. And they operate under regulations and statute that we have in California. And then you'll see the dotted line to direct service professionals and supports. The service providers hire staff to make sure that there's local supports for individuals. And then service coordination, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, as to the role of the regional center and how service coordination is the core element. And I know many of you provide social service supports and are probably pretty familiar with what it entails in trying to do coordination of services. So the next slide provides you a snapshot of the regional center map. I know it's really hard to see on the slide, but there's also, you can have access to this PowerPoint, and there's a link that you can go and take a look at the map. So it shows in very small print, but it shows all 21 regional centers. And in the top right of the PowerPoint, you'll see that there's a cluster of the LA County regional centers. So all of the regional centers in LA County are parceled out, and it is a very dense area, but you will see that there's identified regional centers within those counties. And then the next slide will show what is the developmental services and eligibility in California. I talked about Lanterman services, and while Early Start is a service and it is outlined in the Lanterman Act, the Lanterman Act really is about an entitlement to services. I think this is a really important piece, because when you take a look at California, we're extremely unique as far as a national effort as to how to provide services. And it goes all the way back to those families that really pushed and said, we need to have a different resource for our family members for services for people with disabilities. There's other states, every so often my peers will say, we also have an entitlement. I don't know if I really see that as the total entitlement that the Lanterman Act actually provides. That means that without regard to income, any geographic, any other legal status, anything that is with an individual, the eligibility is solely based on if you have a disability based on the definition of intellectual and developmental disabilities in California, you are eligible for services in California. And this also is then funded. We have funding through the Home and Community-Based Services Waiver, as well as other state SPAs that help us access federal dollars. We have approximately a 50-50 split between our state and federal dollars that supports the services in California. The core, kind of the heart of what regional centers do, is service coordination. This has really been kind of part of the area in which families have raised concerns, and regional centers have raised concerns over recent years, because during the Great Recession and during time, regional centers did not have an increase in a lot of the operations dollars, and caseloads did get very high. We were seeing caseloads around 1 to 80, 1 to 90. And when you're really trying to help a family navigate systems and be able to access services, that became a particular challenge. I'm happy to say that we've recently really targeted funding to be able to have support to families, particularly with no or low purchase of service. That means that if there's somebody who's eligible for regional center services, but we can track that they're not receiving any services that the regional center is paying for, is usually an indication that there's probably a need out there that's being unmet. This is particularly true within our Native American community. When we take a look at Early Start services and look at all of the individuals in Early Start, we have data that shows us within our Native American community that we're about 18% without purchase of service. And the next level of lack of purchase of service is at 10 and 11%. So you'll see that there's a real gap between how we get access to services. And that's why we changed and have an initiative where we have each regional center has funding to be able to have a caseload of 1 to 40 for those with low to no purchase of service that are interested. So that was a new initiative that was recently rolled out. We also, the Lanterman Services supports and provides community supports in the family home, and then making sure that we're also providing the policies to be able to have initiatives to help individuals to be able to live and to be able to engage with their peers without disabilities. Early Start is a particular passion of mine. I started my career at the Regional Center working with children from birth till 5 years old. This is the time that we really get to be able to leave a mark in a family and child's life. And so when we look at the opportunities, this is the time when we can really provide supports and to be able to have the pathway for their future. Many years ago during the Great Recession, one of the areas of at risk was actually eliminated from the services for developmental services. It's only been in the recent years that we were able to restore that. It's remarkable. Not only have we restored it, we have proposed this year in this year's budget to be able to change the eligibility for Early Start. We have proposed in this year's budget to reduce caseload ratios that are currently at 1 to 62 to be able to propose for those from birth through age 5 that the caseload ratios for the regional centers will be at 1 to 40. So being able to provide that intense and focused supports is really important. We're also proposing to change the eligibility criteria to open that net to make sure that we are looking at kids and families in a way that the needs are today, as opposed to what was defined several decades ago. So right now for Early Start, eligibility is that you have a delay of 33% in one category. And what we have done, we have proposed to change that down to 25%. And to further that definition of categories is that we are seeing that children that have receptive delays in their language is oftentimes an earlier indication of longer term needs. But the criteria was really based on communication, which was both receptive and expressive language. And so when we're taking a look at that language, so I guess to clarify, hopefully I said that the expressive language is what we're seeing as the delay that we want to really mitigate risk. So we're proposing to separate that as two distinct categories. So if somebody has an expressive language delay of 25%, they would now be eligible under Early Start. We have been seeing that children who are leaving Early Start, and tomorrow you're going to hear some more about that in one of the panels, is that we're seeing children who are leaving Early Start. Oftentimes we had some children who are coming back to the regional center at later years, 7, 8 years old with a diagnosis of autism. So there is a gap of services that could have been provided by the regional center that we were not able to provide because they had exited out of Early Start and not eligible. So why is this important? Is because we're seeing it primarily within our communities of color. African-American children were, and also our Latinx community were a high number of children who came back to the regional center at a later date with autism because they were wrongly exited because there was not an identification of a delay. And we really see this as a phenomenal opportunity to make sure that we're not leaving children behind. So the next slide, please. So what is a developmental disability? I'm not going to read all of this, but it's definitely there for your reference. So again, it's for children or adults who prior to the age of 18 have a diagnosis of an intellectual disability, autism, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, and or another disability that resembles those categories that I just identified. But they also have, like I said, it occurs prior to the age of 18, and it's expected to be lifelong, and it constitutes a substantial disability. And then the substantial disability is listed below that. And so on the next slide, this is really about the lifespan for individuals and how we can provide supports and what we're looking to do. One of the things that I have just really been leading with and a priority that I've shared with our broad community is to say, let's really change the thought and how we're providing services and supports early on. Because there's times when we talk to families who have an adult child, you know, and wanting to be able to gain employment or start working on what are those integrated opportunities in the community. So let's take a look at those opportunities as early on as we can. So you'll see that the lifelong span of services for developmental services is from birth through death. and the support should be there, and really being able to tailor in a person-centered way based on where the individual is within their life and during that time. You'll see that we have early start listed, and then you'll see we have Lanterman listed. The one that I haven't talked about yet is this provisional eligibility. This also goes under the service access and equity, in which we're trying to address, because those children that were leaving the early start program and coming back later, is that we also wanted to make sure that we were doing everything that we could to make sure that that opportunity was there to support them. So this is a brand new initiative that we have that's been approved, and we're changed the eligibility under the Lanterman Act, that for 3 and 4-year-olds, that if you have a continued delay, but you are not eligible under the definition of the Lanterman Act that was on the prior slide, that you can stay within the regional center services for those 2 years. Again, recognizing that oftentimes children with autism are not identified and having a diagnosis, and that delay, if we're not able to continue to monitor and support them, can really demonstrate some delays in services and intervention that can be critical for the lifelong path for the child and the family. The next slide. This is the regional center populations, and that's what I was sharing with you, that you'll see that over the years, things have changed as to the population within each of the regional centers. So you'll see the smallest regional center is Redwood Coast, which is in the farthest northern point of California, and they have approximately 4,200 children individuals of all ages that they support, with the largest regional center being Inland Regional Center for San Bernardino Riverside counties, and they support 40,600 individuals in their catchment area. The average in the middle would be 18,000 we have a couple of regional centers in that area. It's like San Andreas, South Central are right around 18,000. So when you consider that we are continuing to grow approximately 15,000 individuals per year, some would say we're growing a regional center per year. But we are making sure that we're supporting the regional centers in their efforts. And we do have certain regional centers are growing based on the affordability of housing is our best assumption as to why certain areas are growing faster than others. But we're also seeing differences in our data that we want to continue to track. Because if we are not able to track what is the changes within each of the communities, what is the demographics, the ethnicity, the language preferences, and then also taking a look at those children that have autism as one example, that are aging and going into employment, really talking to those individuals about what is it that their vision is for receiving services and how can we best meet those needs. We need to make sure that our Native American community is fully represented in these conversations. And so there's going to be really great opportunities that I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. So what are the roles? So DDS. So here's the State Department. Nothing like a pandemic to be able to provide an opportunity to get to the community to say, here's the State Department and that supports developmental services. Didn't realize that was going to be our platform that was going to happen. But as we were facing the pandemic, we went out and started having a lot of Zoom public meetings, had an opportunity to really be able to hear the voices from across the state, where primarily we had been meeting in Sacramento or meeting in Southern California, and those who could actually travel there. We now had a different opportunity to hear not only from the regional centers, but their families that they're serving in some of the most rural areas. Pretty phenomenal. And that is really what helped us inform our policy changes. To say that one voice doesn't matter is incorrect. It's so important for us to hear what those voices are so we can help set the stage for recommendations for policy and changes that we can improve access to our services. We oversee and we have responsibility for oversight of all of the services in California, and we're responsible for state and federal laws. Regional centers is the first point of entry where they're doing the assessment, determining eligibility, providing the service coordination, and then also making sure that they're developing the services for service providers to be able to have a network of providers to meet the needs within their community. They also provide oversight of those providers and then support individuals also in accordance to state and federal laws. And then the next slide, please. I wanted to just put in the vision because really we're leaning in very much about what is it that we can do. Anything we develop has to be through the lens of service access and equity. So if you have a moment, I think it's worth taking a look at. This was developed with our advocates and our families that work with us and give us recommendations. Really wanted to make sure that we were highlighting choice, the beliefs, the values, language preferences, culture, because we are certainly a state, a very diverse state, and we have to honor and respect each of these individual cultures and language preferences. Next slide, please. So what are some examples of some of our priorities? So as a system, right now we have about 53 new policy and initiatives that we're implementing. In talking about some of these initiatives, I really want to make sure that we are working with all of you to make sure you're aware of what those are, because these are some really great opportunities to be able to gain access and engage and make sure that you also have a seat to be able to access some of those resources. And within service access and equity, we're certainly doing targeted outreach. We have $10 million every year right now for cultural and linguistically sensitive services that's available. It's really nice to see that this is not just one time, that this is an ongoing commitment that the legislature and the administration invested. Implicit bias training, for every regional center staff that we're going to be providing, and it's mandated, particularly those who are doing assessments and reviews, that they need to have implicit bias training. And we're working on what that looks like today as to a contract for that. Enhancing service coordination, and then transition supports from Part C, so early start, to education, really helping service coordinators understand what those opportunities are, but also families. We have a proposal right now to be able to have specialists at the department and at the regional center to work with local education, but to be able to see how do we best support individuals and families to be able to have opportunities for education also in a very integrated and meaningful way. Self-determination. This is definitely an area, if you're not familiar with it, of the self-determination program that changed into law. I think it was back in 2014. I might be off by a little bit. Providing an opportunity for families and individuals to be able to manage their own budget and their own spending plan, and be able to have a greater freedom and choice of managing their own services. This honestly is a great opportunity to explore and see how can this be a benefit within the tribal communities. We really believe within our Latinx community and some of the other communities, particularly in those families and the cultures that have multi-generational families. And so trying to see how do you get the supports in a way that is also sensitive within language and culture that may be those preferences. We're happy to provide additional training on this, where there's really great outreach. And this is an area that I think may be underrepresented as far as opportunities for learning that we can certainly work with you on advancing. Employment, being able to advance employment, competitive integrated employment. What are those opportunities? We're really working on a purposeful career pathway. And then direct service worker, prioritizing that as professionalizing it. This is a significant opportunity. So anybody who's interested in working within the direct service professional realm for individuals who have a developmental disability, oftentimes we're facing minimum wage jobs. And while there may have been the interest and the passion and the heart to stay in the work, sometimes it just wasn't something they could do to support their families. And so here's a really phenomenal opportunity. We have approved, we're working on the structure of it. Likely next year it'll be in place, what we're calling DSP University, that we're going to be able to train staff, and at each of these tier levels, tier 1, 2, and 3, they're kind of like accomplishing different modules of training, that the state is going to support the difference in payment to those staff at $1 or $2 at every single one of those tier levels. And so this would stay with that staff person no matter where they went to work. We're really trying to see how can we recruit and retain individuals to support Californians who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. The next slide. So what about the tribal community advocacy? This may be somebody, some of you are familiar, this beautiful family. Susan came to DDS. She shared a report that was done by CTFC. And when I heard about it, I was reading the report. I'm like, this just can't be true. But when we're looking at it and started seeing the work that went behind it, clearly there had been a lot of effort and surveys done to really assess what we were doing as far as early start services within the tribal communities. And it was not good. And it was not okay. And so when Susan came and started sharing some of these experiences, I'll tell you, it hurt my heart. You know, as I shared with you, I started my career in early start. And when I started seeing what we were doing and kind of leaving families behind, we needed to do something different. And, you know, we still have a lot more work to do. We as a state department and the regional centers have a lot of learning to do. We need to listen a lot. But not only do we need to listen, we need to lead with purpose. And so what we did this last year is that we proposed, it wasn't, I don't think it was that long before we had put an initiative in the state budget, and it was approved to have $500,000 for tribal engagement, particularly focused on early start and seeing how we can make sure we're advancing this work. It's just incredible to see what's already being started to be able to make change. I want to make sure we don't let our foot off that gas pedal, because this is definitely an area that we can have improvement on. And I'm extremely excited about what we can do. The other part that I think is important is that not only did we say, hey, let's go ahead and have some funding available that we can work, have the regional centers and a couple of tribal communities work in partnership and really see what are the possibilities. We have a disparity grant program where we have $11 million every year that we can prioritize. How do we improve service access to those who are underserved across California in developmental services? So what we did is that last year we put in the guidelines that a priority was outreach and engagement within tribal communities and how we can improve those services. So prior to that, and I'm going to have to use my cheat sheet, but prior to that, when we were looking at the number of grants that we were providing that really touched on the efforts, we were underrepresented. So we had, like in the first year in 17, 18, I think it was like 3 grants. In the next year, I think we went up to 6. And the next year we raised it even a little bit more. But we ultimately got to 19 and 21. Right now, that's the number of grants and proposals that we have funded that are very targeted and outreach within California and the tribal communities. So I just want to say thank you for the advocacy, because if this was not done, we probably wouldn't have been able to raise that awareness to be able to make those changes. There's so much more that we're going to be able to share tomorrow. So those of you who are joining us tomorrow, that we're going to be able to touch on some of those other significant efforts. But I just want to say that we are truly committed, very committed to making sure that we're continuing these efforts and want to see if there's anything that we can do. Don't hesitate to reach out to myself or my team. So if you could advance to like the last 2 slides of the presentation. Because I want to be respectful of your time. I'm not going to go through all of these. They're definitely there, some of the initiatives that we have for different services and initiatives. But here is the resources and links. So you'll see that there's a number of resources that you can access. And also on the next slide is the rest of like the early start laws and different services. But I do want to thank you. And again, just the opportunity to be able to lift up what developmental services does, to open the door to see how we can improve and make sure that we're providing those services and gaining access to those who can provide those services. And we'll look forward to seeing hopefully all of you or many of you tomorrow in further discussions. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. When I was on the bench, access to developmental services for clients was always sort of a mystery, where you made a request, dropped it in a box, and hopefully somebody responded. So a chance to share and understand what actually works, what people are eligible for, and maybe even advocate for underserved communities is a great opportunity. So thank you for bringing that to us today. For those of you who are able to join us tomorrow, there will be much more in-depth and an opportunity to ask questions and hopefully problem solve with you. So I'm going to ask the next panel to come up. It's not on the program, but somebody whispered in my ear that this was an all-star panel. Of course, the problem of being an all-star is expectations rise. So I'm going to turn this over to Kim.
Thank you, Your Honor. Gotta move it down. Good morning, everybody. Again, lovely to be here and lovely to be here in person. And thank you to the folks who are joining us online. I want to start with saying thank you to Chairman Smith from Paula for his opening this morning. Thank you so much for that, for getting us started in a good way. It's really important in this work that we start in a good and grounded way, really aware of the day ahead of us. So thank you. I also want to thank DDS, the folks from the Department of Developmental Services. You know, it's really interesting to be mindful and think about how the families that we all do work on behalf of, that we have the honor of working with, they're multidimensional. They're sometimes complex. And so we need to be sure that we break out of maybe the silo that we work within and reach across and make sure that the families are receiving the whole complement of services that they need. So the work that is done in keeping families together and bringing resources to them is so important. And then the resources that come from other agencies, for example, at the state level. And so serving those families in all of their beautiful complexity is, again, really an honor, but it raises the bar and it means we have lots of work to do. So I am honored to moderate this panel, and I'm going to use Judge Thorne's word, this panel of superstars, and I get to introduce them. So going first is going to be Delia Sharp. Delia is the Executive Director of the California Tribal Families Coalition. She has a storied career starting at California Indian Legal Services. And since we all, you have the bios in the program, I encourage you to read them. It's always helpful to know who's speaking. I'm also going to tell you that one thing I know about Delia is that she once jumped out of an airplane and the parachute didn't open. And guess what? She landed safely. She did just fine. I'm kidding. That didn't actually happen. But I mean, it's not in the program and, So Angie Schwartz, I'm not going to make up a story like that about you. I would love to, but joining us also on the panel is Angie Schwartz. She is the Deputy Director of Children and Family Services. And Angie comes to this work after decades of fierce advocacy, sometimes I think probably on the other side of some state agencies in some counties, working as a fierce advocate for kids, for youth, for children. And so we're really, really pleased to see her here and really thrilled that she's at the helm at the state and that we all get to work in partnership with someone who comes with that fierce advocacy. And Angie does have 2 kids. And I asked her this morning about that, and I asked her, does she like them? And she said she in fact does like her 2 children, which I think is a really good sign. And then also joining us on the panel is Kim Wrigley, sitting in the center. Kim is the chief of the Resources Family Bureau at CDSS. She leads the team there on all issues related to RFA. That's Resource Family Approval. I try to not speak an acronym. I'm not very good at it. And one thing about Kim is that she comes with some direct field experience. She worked in Orange County, she worked in the field, she worked in integrated services. So she brings direct services to her work at that policy level, and that's always really helpful. And you need to know that in college, she got to be an extra in a movie. And so, wow, I'm super impressed with that too. Okay, So this panel is going to be focusing on when and how the state works across to make sure that they're integrating policies as they develop them with the needs of tribal families, tribal youth, and the Indian Child Welfare Act and all the policies that go with that. We're going to focus on resource family approval issues, and I'm going to turn it over to Delia.
Thank you, Micah. Technology for a hybrid conference, about as difficult as you might imagine. I think our team is doing a great job, and I'd certainly like to thank both the ICWA for hosting this conference and all of the folks that are behind the scenes trying to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And of course, I'd like to thank all of our tribal leaders for being here, both today, yesterday, and also tomorrow as we kick off the Disability Symposium, the very first annual Disability Symposium. But I feel like before I get started, I probably need to explain that I haven't actually jumped out of an airplane and had my parachute not open. There's a saying that goes with this work, apparently, that we're going to like build the plane while we're flying it. And I'm not a fan. I don't know what that would look like, but I'm pretty sure that it would result in like pretty imminent death. And so I'm a big fan of like, let's do some preparation, like build the plane, let's have it flying, and then, yeah. There's another one that we've come to though, like building the bicycle while riding. Again, like not a huge fan, but better than flying a plane while you're, anyway. It's a bit of an inside joke, but I thought I needed to explain it to you lest you think I'm made out of like rubber or something. But I have the honor of talking with you all today about resource family approval and the work that we've done with AB 686 back in 2019 to integrate the Indian Child Welfare Act's requirements into it. So I will stay focused on that topic, but it's absolutely a pleasure to be able to talk with you all today. I'm very excited about it. Okay, getting started. So first of all, a little tiny bit of background behind AB 686. So many of you know this because we talk on a fairly regular basis. But at California Tribal Families Coalition, we field calls that if I were to the state, I'd probably consider like technical assistance. But really, they're just calls for, at least in my world, information about how to kind of overcome a barrier that has presented itself. And at CTFC for a long time, it was, just me and then Susan and I. And now still we have a team of 11, but all those calls still come directly to my cell phone number. So I have the pleasure of taking calls from many of you in the audience on a daily basis. But back in 2017, 2018, I fielded a lot of calls from tribal social services staff and families who were facing kind of a new problem. And what that new problem is that their children had been removed from care and they had a placement, right? Tribal social worker had a placement, usually a relative, or it was a family that wanted to be placement, but they were told they had to go through the resource family approval process. And through that process, they were being denied or that the approval wasn't happening fast enough. And that was interfering with their ability to be a placement for a particular child, right? And that was resulting in Indian children ending up in what we often term as stranger care, right? And so we started looking into kind of what were the issues behind that. And one of the things we found is that there had been this new distinction between approval and placement, right? That the resource family approval is not about placement. It's about approval of a home for not even just a specific children, but lots of children. And it makes a lot of sense, right? We need a pool of foster families to be placement for children. We know that. But there became a bit of a rub with the Indian Child Welfare Act, where the Indian Child Welfare Act not only provides us with a hierarchy of where Indian children should be placed, right? We know that children should be placed first with family and then with community and then with another home that's approved by the tribe, right? We know that. But there's another provision of the Indian Child Welfare Act. It's found at USC 1915 sub D, so just after the hierarchy provisions, that says that the approval of those homes should be consistent with the prevailing social and cultural standards of the Indian community. And that was being lost in the resource family approval process. And because approval was being thought of as separate and apart from placement, it wasn't necessarily even hitting the courtroom, right? It was happening largely within, kind of the county system outside of that. And it was felt by us to be something very urgent, in part because it was happening statewide. And there's no way that we were going to be able to go into California's 58 counties fast enough to ensure that there was a system, that would ensure integration of the Indian Child Welfare Act consistently across the board, right? So what California Tribal Families Coalition did in coordination with tribes across the state was work with Assemblymember Waldron to pass AB 686, which is actually fairly simple in nature. There's actually 3 provisions, one of which we won't talk about, guaranteeing tribes the right to telephonic appearance. That's separate, but also part of the bill. But the 2 provisions in AB 686 specific to resource family approval are 1, the integration of the prevailing social and cultural standards of the Indian community, and then 2, a requirement that the California Department of Social Services specifically consult with tribes to integrate that requirement into regulation, right? We heard yesterday about how, and in a case, whether it's the state moving legislation or, a nonprofit, there's 1, the getting the bill passed, right? And then there's 2, the implementation. And so we included a consultation component to try to ensure that tribes had a voice in the implementation, and not necessarily just CTFC. We're a rather inclusive group. We want voices across the board in all of our work, right? So that was the requirement for CDSS to consult with tribes across the state. So long story short, we took that requirement from the Indian Child Welfare Act, again at 1915 sub D. We included it in the Welfare and Institutions Code section you see on your screen below. And so what it reads now in that section is that in the case of an Indian child, this is important, for whom the child's tribe is not exercising its right to approve a home, right? So if the tribe is approving a home, this doesn't apply at all. Tribe continues to do what the tribe did before, but where the county is approving the home, the county shall apply the prevailing social and cultural standards of the Indian community to resource family approval for that particular child, right? And then again, included that the department shall engage in the tribal consultation process and develop the regulations to implement the clause. So really kind of wanted to prioritize also that the regulations to implement happened timely, right? Because there's a lot happening in child welfare. I mean, you all see it. You all see it, even in the world of ICWA right now, there's so much happening. I mean, how many days go by that you're not getting an email from either CTFC or CDSS about, some really great thing that's moving forward, and we're all trying to keep up with it, right? So here, because what the state is doing outside of regulations is working through all county directives, that's where we initially see kind of regulations through all county directives. So CTFC had requested in consultation with CDSS that the sort of baseline provisions of AB 686 get immediately included in the written directives. And so that's what you'll see when you look at written directive 7.0, and you'll hear more about that from the folks at CDSS. We won't go into that. What I do want to really highlight, because as we have continued to engage with tribes across the state, and as we've gone back and really taken a hard look at what are those issues that brought this to our attention to begin with, and what are the things that tribes were really asking for. And we've really done a lot of engagement around this. And my bet is that, through consultation, these are probably the takeaways from CDSS as well. But there are 3 key areas of implementation through regulations that we would love to see in final written directives, and that also, as we train county staff, that we really highlight. So 1, it is imperative for counties to communicate with tribes early regarding the approval of homes for their children. Partnership is key. Let's keep in mind that as a result of CTFC-sponsored legislation, AB 3176, that even at detention, placement of an Indian child must be consistent with ICWA's placement preferences, even at detention. That means that the county needs to be partnering with the tribe prior to removal, so that if removal becomes necessary, there's a placement available for that child with family, okay? So that really, it's imperative for the counties to be communicating early. Number two, that the Indian community standard is tribal specific. There is no one standard. And that I think has been something that has been a little bit of a challenge, because I think it makes some sense to me that folks on the county level really would like to be able to identify, what is the tribal standard that we should be applying, right? But it's simply not that easy. There are 109 federally recognized tribes in the state of California, and each of those tribes are sovereign nations. And so it requires communication with those tribes. That's the way it is. And again, would love to actually see that particular language in the written directives and final regulations. Number three, collaboration must occur in all aspects of the home approval process. And that includes background check review and approval, the home studies, and the interviews and approval updates. So again, we need to have communication early and then continuing through all phases of that approval process. And with that, I thank you very much for your time. And I will hand it over to Kim Wrigley.
I'm short. Okay, is that all right? Okay, so not only am I short, but I'm realizing that I think there's a slide that kind of shows some of the timeline of the work we've done for AB 686. So hopefully we'll be able to pull that up. If not, I'm sure it'll show up at some point here. But I have to. Oh, okay. Oh, look at that. Okay. Well, that's really good because I printed out a copy for myself and I realized my eyes are old and I can't read the tiny print. So anyway, I feel like AB 686 has been a wonderful opportunity for CDSS and CTFC and all of our tribal partners to really work together and collaborate on how to implement this really important piece of legislation. And as Delia has already highlighted on, we started back in 2019, where we did present this at the annual Tribal Consultation Summit. And we started drafting what that policy may begin to look like. And we all agreed that we would start with a regional approach at that point in time. So then throughout 2019 and into 2020, we did set up multiple virtual, I don't think we intended it to be virtual initially, but they became virtual scoping sessions where we really worked with the tribal leaders, social services, our state reps, pretty much everyone involved having a piece of AB 686 on what this would look like. Between September and October 2020, we also agreed that we needed to take this from a larger regional approach and start developing it into some really smaller work groups so that you could really get to the meat of the work and how to incorporate it. Delia did an excellent job of highlighting some of the challenges of how to implement this when you don't have a one size fits all, nor do you want a one size fit all, because each child is unique, each family is unique. And really at the core of RFA, Resource Family Approval, that was the intention as well. However, we also know that there's additional unique pieces that you need to look at when you're assessing a family who is taking in a placement of an ICWA eligible child. So then we followed up again in September 2020 with another annual tribal consultation where we updated and started really planning out those regional steps. We agreed at the suggestion that we would include at least the statutory language of AB 686 into version 7 of the written directives, which are the rules and regulations for RFA. We weren't ready to expand at that point in time because we needed that regional work group to really assess what language needed to be enhanced, but we wanted something out there to start off with. So we did draft up some language. We gave everybody an opportunity to provide feedback on that language. Edits, reviews were incorporated. And in January of 2021, we did publish version 7 of the written directives. But obviously, that was not enough. And we knew at the time that was not enough. So we did begin later on in that year. We had more regional meetings, 2 rounds of regional meetings on very small basis. I think it was 3 different regions we worked with 2 separate times. So about 6 meetings total. And we wanted to be sure we had our tribal partners included, county leaders, FFAs, everybody that was going to be working with the resource families to ensure that all of this work was, that we heard from everybody so that we could really enhance beyond what the statutory language was. So then, what year is that? December of 2021, I'm sorry, at the slide, that 686 up there is covering it. December of 2021, after a lot of work groups and a lot of discussion back and forth, we did draft up some language that would go into version 8 of the written directives. We sent that out for stakeholder feedback. There was a lot of feedback. So I think there was a lot of good back and forth on how we could really ensure that version 8 accomplished a lot more than what version 7 did with implementation of AB 686. Some of the important pieces in the language we drafted was that communication that Delia highlighted early on. At every step of the process, the tribe must be consulted. It's not may, you must consult as a county worker, as an FFA worker with the tribe at each stage of the process. We also realized some of our RFA forms needed to be looked at as well. The RFA forms needed to include pieces in there to ensure that it's documented that that communication occurred, and that it was known that when this was a resource family where there were some Indian community standards applied, but also ensuring that the county understood that one standard for this family does not mean that same standard would be or should be applied to the next family. So this is some of the work we are still actually working on. The beginning of this year, we sent out, we sent out the final language of AB 686 for some more review. And what's happening now is we incorporated that, but there's a lot more things we're doing to version 8 of the written directives. So I got new updated news. We were wanting to get the full version 8 of the written directives out for our stakeholder feedback. I do think that will happen sometime this month. We got our review from our legal team back yesterday. So now it's a process of us reviewing and cleaning up the finalized draft. I'm going to stress that word draft. So that should be going out. Please don't hold me this, but in the next 2 to 3 weeks, I would anticipate we'll be able to share the full version 8 of the written directives, which will include all of this important work. It will also include some stuff we'll talk about a little bit later today about SB 354. I think those are the two major things that are going to be happening in version 8 of the written directives. So you will have an opportunity again to look at it, review, provide feedback, and then we hope to have the written directives released in July or August. Later than we anticipated, but as you'll hear in our next session, SB 354, it's a complicated bill. So that's taken some time to really ensure that we get all that information accurate and included into version 8. But when that is released, we'll also be releasing some of our updated forms to really incorporate that documentation piece. Some other things we really want to stress in terms of AB 686 is, as you can see, we're publishing version 8 of the written directives. That's not going to be the final version of the written directives ever published. The beautiful thing with our written directives is we have an opportunity to continue to grow and enhance and learn. So as we're implementing version 8, in all likelihood, we'll learn that there's some more changes that need to occur. And that feedback is critical from the people utilizing the written directives. I don't know what needs to be changed unless I hear from the people utilizing it. So I'm going to reach out to you, or I'm going to ask that you reach out to us. If you're working with counties and you're seeing that there's some challenges here, let us know. What can we do to further enhance, further evolve RFA to ensure that 686 is implemented in the way that it was intended? We want this to be successful, and we're still learning and we're still growing. So I really want to stress, please work with Office of Tribal Affairs, with my team directly, because we do want to continue to grow. We'll continue to improve that. Some other ways that we want to ensure that AB 686 is being accomplished and implemented appropriately, accurately, and to the best intent of the law is we do biennial reviews of every county. And our CCL partners at CDSS also review FFAs. We are in the process of updating our biennial review tools to ensure that we are actually looking at cases when counties do have cases where Indian community standards were applied to the resource family approval. We want to look at that. And we will provide feedback and technical assistance to the counties if we see that there were some things that didn't go exactly as it was intended to go. So we are working to enhance our own review process to make sure that 686 is implemented and being utilized accurately. But again, we do provide ongoing technical assistance beyond the biennial reviews. Every day we are answering questions, receiving emails, working through with counties on specific situations, specific cases. Angie and I sometimes talk about specific cases ourselves. It's like, how can we improve and ensure that the written word is not getting in the way of the intent of what we wanted to happen. But again, we don't know. So if you are working with a county and it's not going the way you want, please, we do have on this slide some emails addresses that you can use to reach out to us. And we want to hear. We want to be sure that we're working with you, we're working with the county to make sure that collaboration is occurring from day one of the resource family approval process, post-approval with every update that's occurring. So we want to be sure that it is happening and that we're continuing to improve the process. But generally, I really feel like this was a really great starting place for us to take a piece of legislation and work together. I think this is a good example of taking that regional approach, having that back and forth sharing of information to really grow the wonderful work we're all doing here. So again, yeah, if you have specific situations, we've got the RFA email address there. We have a wonderful person who responds to questions very timely, the Tribal Affairs email. If you do have questions about placements, because sometimes there's a little bit of a challenge of separating the placement and the approval process together, please, we've got that child protection email address there. We really want to work with you to make sure this is being implemented in the way we intended. So I think that's my piece. I'm going to turn it over to Angie now, who I think is going to speak more generally.
Just like gonna try not to type. Oh, I did. I wonder if I can just do this. It kind of works, except for like now it's like frozen. And now it turned off. Hold on a second. Yeah. This is why you should come with like written paper, I suppose. Come on. Okay, I think I got it to work. I'm Angie Schwartz, Deputy Director with the Children and Family Services Division at DSS. And I want to start by acknowledging and thanking the Sycuan tribe for hosting us today and for all of the tribal leaders who are here, many of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting in person for the first time since taking this role, and that's been wonderful to make those connections. Also want to thank the many individuals and organizations that are participating and those that put together the fabulous agenda, and even more so the opportunities for connection and building our networks and our collaborations. It's important that we get to come together in person. And actually, that's what I'm going to talk about more than 686, which I think Delia and Kim did a really good job of talking about the specific example of how we've worked together around that particular piece of legislation. Wanted to talk today about the work that we're doing sort of systemically and across all of our policies and all the programs and all of the development of legislative ideas, all the way through the implementation of those ideas, to have it be a much more inclusive and collaborative process with our tribal partners. And Delia said in her presentation that collaboration in all aspects of home approval has to happen, but actually that collaboration has to happen in all aspects of every single thing that we do in a child welfare system. ICWA is the gold standard for child welfare. It should be the thing that's actually like our guiding light in terms of how we do child welfare, not just for Indian children, but for every single child in California. So I think implementing ICWA with fidelity absolutely has to be our goal, but we need to apply it across all of our children and make sure all kids remain connected to their own cultures and their own communities and their own families. And that's an overarching goal of the department. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're trying to do that specific to the ICWA implementation on that systemic level. Stephanie Walden mentioned yesterday the development of the ICWA state plan, which I'm very excited is, coming. We'll have consultation at the end of July. Hopefully we'll be finalizing that plan this fall and then implementing it. And we really want the implementation to be very robust. We will be doing roadshows and going to different regions of the state and trying to do collaborations with the counties and the tribes and the state together in order to make sure everyone's very familiar with everything that's in the plan, and having a steering committee that comes together to meet regularly on the implementation and oversight of that plan. And the plan itself is really about addressing the problem, which is inconsistent implementation of ICWA across California that continues to harm and break up our Indian families and undermine tribal sovereignty. And so the goal is to put a plan in place where we can actually preserve families and keep children and families connected to their own tribes and their own communities. And we've done that. If you read the plan, which I think probably many of you have seen it, we sort of broke it out by the work that we do. So we have a branch within CFSD that focuses on prevention and early intervention. So how can we avoid having a child removed from a parent in the first instance? And so we really looked at what are we doing within that work and how are we making sure that ICWA is integrated into every aspect of that work. So when you look at the objectives are very much about making sure that everything that we're doing as a branch focused on prevention and early intervention also is thinking about what that means in terms of implementation of ICWA. And that's true when you get to our branch that deals with children that comes into our foster care system and have to be removed. And how do you make sure that they remain connected to their own families, that you've got the tribal home approvals happening, that everything that we were just talking about with 686 is actually how we're implementing the process by which we identify families and we approve in this and allow children to remain connected to those families. So 686 is very much a part of that, but not exclusive. I mean, I think Kim also mentioned SB 354. So we really want to make sure that in implementation of that law as well, that we're thinking about it through that Indian community standards, and that we're making sure that we have our tribal courts and everyone sort of working together in the implementation and making sure our kids can be connected with their own families. We have a system of care branch that is really looking at how the intersection. I really appreciated the remarks from Director Bargman this morning around the developmental services. We work really closely with DDS and DHCS and CDE. I'll stop using alphabet soup. So the Department of Healthcare Services, the Department of Developmental Services, our education partners, to make sure that our children who come into contact with the child welfare system also have all of those other services and supports integrated, and that we're thinking about it in a coordinated whole child, whole family approach to how we work, not just within CFSD, but across the entire Department of Social Services, and then more broadly across all of the other departments that actually come into contact with our children and families. And in that, it's very important to also think about how are you integrating ICWA into all of that work. Diana Wagner spoke yesterday about AB 2083 and our system of care approach and the work that we're doing now to make sure that the interagency leadership teams that exist at the local level, so all counties have put together interagency leadership teams at the local level to kind of come up with the system of care approach. And we really want to make sure our tribes are included in that interagency leadership team as well. And that consultation is happening, not just at the state level in the development of policies and regulations, but at the local level in terms of that integration of practice. So that So when you look at the state plan, you'll sort of see it broken out in a way that sort of tracks how we do our work. We also have our data and continuous quality improvement branch. And so then again, we've looked at how are we making sure that we implement ICWA with fidelity within that work, and that we're thinking about continuous quality improvement through the lens of ICWA. And then we're really making sure that we have systems in place where we can account for whether or not ICWA is working and what we know from the data. What does the data tell us about how we're doing that work? And then permanency as well. So as you move children into permanency, adoption, guardianship, whatever that looks like for the family and actually best supports that child and family member. What does that look like in terms of our policies, in terms of how we make funding available? We have discussions going on right now around the tribal customary adoptions and finalizing that regulation package, as well as making sure that all of our homes that all of our tribal adoptions receive adoption assistance funding. So we're looking at those specific policy areas as well, which is a long-winded way of saying that every single piece of what we do, we're trying to sort of make sure that there's the ICWA element as well. Like, what does this mean from that gold standard in terms of really family engagement and child engagement? And how can that be the way that we're approaching practice in general? And the ICWA state plan sort of has the specific objectives in it that we really need to use as our guiding light to make sure that we know how we're making progress and that we're tracking that progress. We've also tried to do this work in terms of how we put out our all county letters. And Kim talked specifically about AB 686 and the work that went into 686. And that obviously was a piece of legislation that was very specific to tribal communities. And so there was specific consultation and that whole process around 686, which doesn't happen on the development of every single all county letter that we work on. And yet every single all county letter that we work on that could have some sort of impact on our tribal families and children. And so we've tried to create greater transparency for what is in the all county letters that we're working on. We have a tracker. My folks at CDSS are really sick of trackers, but I personally love trackers. So we have a tracker that's sort of tracking every all county letter that's in the works. Like as soon as it gets on the list, we put it on the tracker and sort of know who's, what's that all county letter going to be focused on and who's working on it and where is it in the process. But we also included in that tracker ways to track whether or not this is an all county letter that's going to have a specific impact on our tribal families and communities, and whether or not we need additional engagement on that ACL. Maybe we need consultation and we hadn't thought about it as one of the ACLs that actually requires consultation. So we are trying to share that tracker out with OTA, who shares it out with the tribes every single month so that we can do our take on, like, we think that this is a bill that's going to require some additional engagement or consultation, but then actually get that feedback back from tribes. Like, you thought you didn't need additional engagement on this one, but you do. And then we can incorporate that into our process as well. And we also have the ICWA hotline that is going to be being launched this fall. Again, just a way to make sure that we are hearing directly from folks within communities about what's working. Usually you don't hear about what's working on hotlines. I'm going to be honest, it's generally what's not working. Although, if you ever want to send an email letting us know that something's working, we take those too. But the hotline will probably mostly be things that are not working, which is fine because we actually need to know what's not working so that we can fix what's not working and so that we have that information directly from the field in terms of what really needs to be improved and where we see those breakdowns in implementation. Because you can write the best law and you can write the best set of written directives and the best policies, but it all comes down to the actual practice at the ground. So the hotline is going to enable us to actually hear about those practices on the ground. Same with the dashboard once we get that launched as well, sort of having that transparency in the data and knowing what the data is telling us. And sometimes you'll see that there are actually problems with the data itself, but then we need to correct those problems with the data and make sure that we know that we have as much information that's as accurate as possible so that we can be administering our systems in a way that is making sure that we have fidelity to those programs. I'm just scrolling. This is like, my computer is really not working well. Next time I'm going to print it up and use paper. I was like being mocked last night for saying that I like binders, but this is why I like binders so much. OTA. Because now my computer is breaking down on me. We're also trying to have the same sort of inclusive process in terms of how we come up with ideas and sort of are tracking legislation and thinking about legislation that's pending through the process. So obviously there are specific bills that impact the tribes every year. This year there's the tribally approved home legislation. There's also the legislation about council for tribes, and those things we're obviously directly engaging on. But really, in terms of all the legislation that comes through, we're trying to have that equity lens on every bill that's coming through and do that analysis for every bill that's coming through. So you're not just thinking about it when it's called out as like, this is a CTFC bill, or this is a bill like very specific to the tribes, but just thinking about it as part of our everyday work, everything that we do, need to have that equity framing in terms of how is this going to actually impact all the different parts of our system? And is this fidelity to sort of our overarching goals, which is to make sure that all kids can remain healthy and connected to their own communities and their own families, which really I think has to be the driving principle throughout all of child welfare. So I'm just going to end with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have, and really appreciate the invitation to be here today, and apologize for my technical difficulties.
Wow, and look at that. It is 9:45, right when we plan to end. I just want to wrap up really quickly. I took a whole bunch of notes, so I'm going to just give a summary. One is, if you do have questions, you have concerns, you've got some email addresses now, please use those. And we learned today, you can also say what is working. That's allowed. You won't get like, your computer won't crash if that's what you want to do. Also that, thank you very much that, for example, Angie mentioned about seeking to have adoption assistance payments available for all tribal adoptions. That's really important work to support families. We've got the hotline, we've got trackers. I've made a personal note that Angie hearts trackers. I do want to just end on one note, which is Angie talked about the guiding light principle of whole child, whole family. And I'm going to challenge all of us to take that guiding light principle and turn it into whole child, whole family, whole tribal community. Because we think so much about whole child, whole family. And yet that doesn't encompass that complexity that we started with regard to the Native children, the Native families, the communities that we all have the honor of working on behalf of. So that's the challenge set for everyone today for this morning. And thank you so much. Really appreciate the panelists. Thanks for being here.
You can see why these were the superstars. We're going to take a 10-minute break. Ask you to come back at 10 o'clock. And the panel will be addressing one of the most vexing problems in child welfare that shouldn't be a problem. It ought to be easy to solve, but we haven't solved it yet. And that's criminal background checks, how to get tribes access to that information without having to jump through 15 different hoops and still not get what they need on a timely basis. So if you come back at 10 o'clock, the panel will hopefully help us figure out how to do better. So we'll see you then. Thank you. Just a word in advance, notice the scheduled session that's supposed to start at 1:30 this afternoon is going to start at 1:20. And that's because they want to try and make sure that we build in a break for you in the afternoon. Yesterday, we went from one session to another session to another session, and we're going to try and build in a break for you this afternoon. So leading this panel is somebody that I met a number of years ago who has impressed me with the fact that she's a tireless advocate for children and tribal sovereignty. Those qualities are not all that common. And especially when you don't work for an agency, so there's not a steady income that lets you take unpopular positions or to take causes that can't pay. Joanne is one of those attorneys who seeks to do the right thing and then tries to figure out how to make a living afterwards. And so for that, I am very proud to call her a friend. I'm going to let her introduce her panel.
Thank you, Judge Thorne, for that touching tribute. Wajia, my name is Joanne Willis Newton. I'm a member of the Cree Nation of Tusaspie, which is located in EUSG, Cree Aboriginal Territory in Northern Quebec, Canada. And before I introduce the panel today, I just want to say I'm honored and pleased to have been invited to address you. And I want to say I was really inspired by the theme of the conference, re-indigenizing ICWA, and some of the presentations that I participated in virtually yesterday, particularly Dr. Madrigal, Judge Thorne, Dr. Martinez. And I was inspired to change my choice of outfit for today from my usual attorney attire and channel my mother, my Cree mother, who is still living. She's 81 and she lives on our reserve and just visited California. I got to see her for the first time since the pandemic last week. And the earrings that I'm wearing are ones that I have permanently borrowed from her and were made from a Cree woman from our territory. And the vest is one that I thought really appropriate to wear today. She handed it down to me last year. She made it in the mid 1970s. And that is the same time that ICWA was enacted. So I thought a very appropriate choice for today. My mother is a residential school survivor, as is my grandmother, and as I am. And we all have our trauma histories. And more than that, though, we have our triumphant resilience. And as you work with our families, I invite all of you to recognize that in them and to honor that and to invite them to do the same. Those trauma histories and the paths to healing, those paths can often be crooked with setbacks and detours, resulting in criminal background histories for many of our families. And that fact is one of the contributing factors to their overrepresentation in the criminal justice system and can create an impediment or even a prohibition against them taking in for temporary care or permanent care our children who find themselves also overrepresented in the child welfare system. The panel today will be addressing background checks and some of the difficulties that our families have in getting cleared, and some of the recent work that has been done and is continuing to facilitate the placement of our children with kin. It's my honor to introduce you to our panel. These women here are all staunch advocates for youth. And I'll just go ahead and introduce them all rather than individually as they take the podium. We have Kim Wrigley, if you could just raise your hand. She is the chief with the Resources Family Bureau at CDSS. She's worked in the child welfare system for over 20 years, and she spent the last 8 years working with the Resource Family Approval Program. We have Sabrina Forte, Director of Policy and Impact Litigation with the Alliance for Children's Rights. She works with her policy team to develop and lead targeted impact litigation designed to promote and protect the rights of youth in foster care. And she's also a former staff attorney with the Youth Law Center and the Bay Area Legal Aid Youth Justice Project. Also here is Julie McCormick. She is a senior policy attorney with the Children's Law Center. And she came to the Children's Law Center after practicing in family law for 10 years. And she has 6 years of experience as a dependency trial counsel, including time in the LA ICWA Children's Court. And she is a certified child welfare law specialist. And last but not least, we have Michelle Castaigne, who as an Anishinaabe woman is one of my distant cousins. And she's enrolled with the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians. She's a relatively recent law school graduate with a particular interest in health law. And she currently works at CTFC researching issues relating to the Indian Child Welfare Act. So I'm going to turn it over to them to give their presentations.
Thanks so much, Joanne, and really thank you for recentering the theme because we are back up here to talk about some legal issues that we are facing, that tribes are facing in accessing criminal background check information and a new change in law that gives more flexibility in the criminal background check process. And so it's hard to kind of, I think about re-indigenizing that process, but it's important that we talk about it still because tribes need and should have access as sovereign nations to the kind of information we need to vet homes for our kids and make sure that they're safe. And so that's what we're doing. And I just appreciate you kind of starting us off in that way and thinking about why does this matter for tribes? Why are we up here talking about it today? I will say, again, really the focus and intent of this panel is to share with you a recent law change that gives actually tribes and all county agencies more flexibility in doing the background check process. And so that was through a law that was passed last year, SB 354. But for my very small part of this panel, I just want to give a brief background and some context of where tribes have been in this process. How do we currently access background check information in the child welfare system, and where are we still seeing the sticking points? Where are we not able to access that information? So this may be pretty obvious to many of you, but just as a quick sort of context for why we're talking about criminal background checks here, when children are placed in out-of-home placements, either through foster care or adoption-related proceedings, the child welfare system must first vet the homes where those children are placed. So we want to make sure that our kids are being placed in out-of-home placements that are safe for them, and that requires background checks, criminal background checks of any adult living within the home. Tribes often work with county partners or place children out of home themselves, and the authority to do so, at least in the state welfare system, was granted through ICWA in 1978. And we do this in two ways as tribes, right? We can either approve our own homes when we're looking to place children, or we can work with state agencies to place children out of home. When ICWA was passed, however, there were no federal laws that were governing the background check process. And so it didn't really contemplate how do tribes do that process? How do we get access to criminal background check information, which is often held in county or state or federal data systems. So since ICWA was passed, we've had a series of federal and state laws that have sort of changed this process that now do govern the background check process. So in 1990, there was a federal law that was passed that started requiring background check screenings of all federal and tribal employees who have contact with Indian children. And then in 2006, we had the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, which my co-panelists will talk more about because the new state law change that we'll be talking about has implications with the Adam Walsh Act. And then very recently in 2016, we had another federal law that was passed that required tribes to conduct background checks, including fingerprint-based and name check-based background checks in all child abuse and neglect cases for adults living within the home. So this series of federal laws, and again, there are several state laws that we'll talk about, demonstrates that it was Congress's intent that tribes need and are authorized to access background check information. But as probably many of you face, we don't always have that access. So as recently as 2014, tribes here in California were not able to access most background check registries. That was changed when Season Good Pasture and the Paula Band of Mission Indians applied to get access to the background check registry, and that access was granted, which led to tribes presenting a united front and passing a law here in California that opened up access to those systems for tribes. On the sort of the back end of that process and getting tribes that access, CTFC and other tribal advocates realized that there were still issues. We still weren't able to access all of the kinds of background checks that we needed to. And so CTFC and many tribal advocates worked on putting together a report. We did listening sessions, we did surveys, we checked in with tribal social workers about what more do we need to be able to make sure that we're placing kids in safe homes. And what we found in that report, and I just want to pause and thank you to the folks that wrote that report, including Dorothy Waite at California Indian Legal Services, Micah Urandi on CTFC staff who was with CILS at the time, and then also Delia Sharp and Blair Cruiser with CTFC. That report, it is available on our website. It really kind of goes into this history that I'm sharing today and documents one of the main recommendations from tribes, which is that we still, as tribes, do not have access to emergency placement background check information. So that is still something that we need to work on. It is still something that this SB 354 that my co-panelists will be talking about does not address. And so it's something up and coming that we're still working to try to fix. Again, why is this important? Right now, we know that 56% or more than half of our Indian children here in California are not currently being placed in ICWA placement preference homes. So ICWA placement preference homes are, of course, we start with relatives and then we look to tribal members, other Native families, and then others. And so we know right now that over half of our kids are not being placed according to those preferences that are in federal law and have been for over 40 years. If tribes had access to criminal background check information and a slew of other things like funding and could be more involved in the tribally approved homes process and take on more of that role. And I know many of you do, many tribes do that work and are doing it already. But if we had funding and better access, we would be able to place our Indian kids according to those placement preferences, closer to home, closer to their cultural connections. And so that's why this is important. That's why we're talking about what access do we have? How does SB 354 that we'll talk about in a few minutes give a little more flexibility to the process? And that is what my co-panelists will talk about today. So I am going to hand it over to them to tell us about the new law change. We will share during the Q&A some of the resources that are currently available to tribes. And then I definitely encourage you checking out the background check report to know more about the history and where tribes have been with this process, because it has been an ongoing issue that we continue to advocate for changes in.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to skip ahead in the PowerPoint if I can figure out how. Okay, so we're going to spend most of this presentation talking about SB 354. And I'll give a little bit of background on the intent of this law before Kim and I do a deep dive into the details and process of implementing SB 354. And as a warning, Kim and I are going to be doing a little bit of a dance back and forth every couple of slides. We've been doing a series of presentations for county courts and county staff on SB 354 and have kind of gotten into a groove, but it doesn't necessarily lend well to this format. So just bear with us as we go up and down every couple of slides. So SB 354 went into effect this year, January 1st, 2022. And it was the result of the work of a coalition. The bill was sponsored by Senator Nancy Skinner, based in Berkeley, California. And then the co-sponsors of the bill were a combination of county advocates, the County Welfare Directors Association, as well as child welfare advocates like the Alliance for Children's Rights, where I work, and the Children's Law Center of California, where Julie works, and then a coalition of directly impacted individuals who experience the child welfare system in that intergenerational way that Joanne alluded to in her opening remarks. Individuals who had been children in foster care, and then their children were separated from them when they were as parents and placed in foster care. And then many of those individuals had become family members who wanted to become resource parents for those children, for children in their families, and were facing barriers to placement with family because of criminal background checks and difficulties accessing the exemption process. So the goal of SB 354 was really to remove barriers to placement and approval for relatives and non-relative extended family members. And to break down some of the reasons for SB 354, Julie's going to talk later about the growing research on outcomes for children placed with relatives, non-relative extended family members, and kind of the priority placement preferences under ICWA. And those outcomes include reunification related outcomes and outcomes related to the unique ability of relatives and extended family to ground young people in their cultures and their communities. We had heard kind of from the ground up challenges with the criminal record exemption process, posing barriers to resource family approval for caring and capable relative caregivers. And then more recently in 2020, appellate court precedent disfavored some of the categorical bars to placement and approval based on criminal record that have existed for the last several decades. So I'll talk briefly about that appellate court precedent here. Henry CP is a California Court of Appeal decision. So it came up from the county superior courts. And this involved a child who was placed into foster care and had grandparents who were really interested in taking placement of the young person and initiated resource family approval basically from the moment the child was separated from their parents. The child was initially placed in a stranger foster home, eventually was placed in group home care while the grandparents went through the resource family approval process. They were denied resource family approval based on the grandfather's misdemeanor conviction, nearly 3 decades old. But the reason why the grandparents were denied was because this conviction was on a list of non-exemptable convictions. And there was an absolute statutory bar, federal and state statutory bar to approval and placement based on that conviction. And so the grandparents challenged the conviction or challenged the denial of approval and placement based on constitutional grounds and said there is a family-like, parental-like bond between the grandparents and the child that should not be interfered with kind of on a categorical basis. And the court agreed and said an absolute statutory bar to placement could violate the constitutional rights of the family if the family has some sort of close parental-like relationship with the child. And so it raised questions about the criminal background and exemption process that we have here in California, and it made us realize that there was an opportunity to clarify and individualize the process of resource family approval for those relatives and extended family that have those close relationships with children. The holding in Henry CP overlaps with SB 354, but not perfectly. So for example, SB 354 doesn't require that a prospective caregiver prove that they have some sort of parent-like relationship with the child. It's a more streamlined process than that, but Henry CP left open the possibility that not just relatives, but also extended, what we call non-relative extended family members could potentially prove that they had that sort of parent-like relationship. So there's kind of there's an uneven overlap between the statute and the case law, which is why it's important to know the case law, because we know that SB 354 doesn't entirely cover the full range of placement preferences. It's just making you all aware of that. And now we're going to dive into the many details of SB 354. And just as a caveat before Kim comes up, there are some pieces of SB 354 that don't relate to the background check process. There are a couple related to emergency placements and providing resources to families and approval conditions based on financial ability. We're not going to talk about those here because there's so much of the core component of SB 354 to talk about on background checks, but just letting you know that we're going to be diving into the core part, but not necessarily all of the statute. Okay, good.
Thank you so much for that. And actually, that gives me an excellent opportunity to let you know that because SB 354 is such a complicated and in-depth piece of legislation, CDSS will be hosting a webinar to provide more guidance, a deeper dive, answer questions about it. And we're going to be doing two different ones. Either one, anybody is welcome to join. One for the counties, we're still working on a date, and one specifically for the tribes. So we are tentatively looking at that on August 3rd. We will be inviting you to join, sending an invitation out either later this week or early next week. So just that's what the date we're looking at. And that's going to be where you really get into the nitty gritty of SB 354, because there is so much, and this is just going to be a very broad overview. So yeah, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the emergency placement process and how it does relate to SB 354. I think the emergency placement process is an area where we do need to continue to grow the collaboration and the partnership between the county, who has the authority to make the emergency placement, and the tribe when the child coming into care is needing that emergency placement, and that child may be an ICWA eligible child. So first, just to discuss the basic steps. The WIC codes here, 361.4 is for the child welfare side of a county. 727.05 is a recent legislative, I think a few years old now, that allows probation departments to make the emergency placement. It's basically a fairly simple process. You do a very brief in-home inspection to determine the safety of the home. And when I say the safety of the home, that there are no immediate health and safety hazards at that moment. It does not mean that that home at that point in time needs to meet that full in-depth home and grounds inspection that is done with RFA or perhaps with a tribally approved home process. It's just, is there anything immediate going on right now that would jeopardize the health and safety of a child if they were to be placed here right now? A CACI check, acronyms. Child Abuse Check Index, does that sound right? Central, okay. See, I've used CACI so long I've forgotten, but it's to see if there's any substantiated child abuse allegations in the system there. The county made, and that's for all adults living in the home, the potential applicants and others residing in the home. Doing a CWS CMS check on those same adults is an optional check. And then you conduct a state level records check. We call it CLETS. I definitely do not, California law enforcement, blah, blah, blah. Sorry. I really don't know that one. But it's basically a name-based criminal check to see if there's anything that pops up at that moment in terms of criminal history for all the adults residing in the home. If the results of that is clean, there's no criminal record, the child may be placed. Again, it's a may because it is a determination at that point in time. If there is some things that show up on that CLETS check, I'm not going to go into read every word there. The child, there's some things that they may not be placed on an emergency basis, depending on some of the results of the CLETS check. And then there's other areas where they could be based. SB 354 has changed a lot of this, so we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. But this is the basic steps that are required for a county to conduct before an emergency placement may be done. So where do the tribes fit in on this? And the answer to that is very simple, though I know it's not simple in practice yet. The tribes fit in from the very beginning. As soon as a child is being removed from care or is needing that emergency placement and it's an ICWA eligible child, the counties should be collaborating, should be communicating, working with that tribe prior to making the placement decision. We know that is a challenge. We know that that process is not perfected at this point in time. So that's one of the areas we want to continue to grow and work with you and communicate on how we can continue to improve that process. Looking at ways, I think, you know, some of the silver linings, if we can look for silver linings with COVID, is really understanding how much work we can do virtually. Having to do everything in person is not always reasonable or ability-wise to do so, especially if you've got a tribe who's living in a very different part of the state or out of state even, with the California child here. So can they join the county and have that conversation virtually? And at the time the emergency placement is occurring, because you're communicating and working with the tribe at the very beginning stages here, the tribe, county, and caregiver can all determine what is the best approval process for that family to go through after the emergency placement has occurred. Should they go through the tribal approved home process, or would they be going through RFA? Again, that cannot be determined unless everyone is working together and coordinating that and helping the family, because they're not the experts in what's happening next. We need to work with them to help them figure out each step of the process here. Regardless if the family, once they receive that emergency placement, whether it's with a tribally approved home or going through the RFA, there is emergency caregiver funding that is available and should be initiated. With emergency caregiver funding, the only steps are that an emergency placement was made, an application was initiated, whether that's RFA or the tribe's version of that. Is that the right way to say that? Because they may not have a formal application, but that the tribally approved home process has been initiated. And then a form called EA1 has been completed. That's it to start the emergency caregiver funding. So that's really important, because those families need that financial support from day one. They didn't know they were going to have a child 24 hours prior. It's like they're living their lives and boom, now they have a child in their home. I think most of us would struggle financially all of a sudden to have a child placed in their care. So that's very important to get that initiated. Another important factor I really want to stress is if that emergency placement was not made for whatever reason, there could be a variety of reasons that the county decided not to place that child on an emergency basis. That does not preclude them from going through the approval process, either with the tribe or with the resource family approval process, and still determine if they may be approved. Placement and approval with child welfare are very different processes. Placement worker cannot make approval decisions. Approving workers cannot make placement decisions. They need to communicate and collaborate, but they can't determine each other's roles. So that's something that maybe at that point in time, you couldn't make the emergency placement. We want to encourage the family to still move forward and either apply for RFA or work with the tribe on the tribally approved home process. Is this my slide? I lost track of the numbers here. Yep, okay.
Kim gave a great overview of the emergency placement process. The quick summary of how SB 354 changes the emergency placement process is that in the instance that a court is assessing the ability to make an emergency placement with a relative, the juvenile court can place a child with a relative on an emergency or temporary basis, regardless of the status of a criminal record exemption or resource family approval, as long as the court finds that the placement doesn't pose a risk to the health and safety of the child. And likewise, at the disposition hearing, when the court has determined the child is under the jurisdiction of the juvenile court and is making a decision as to what happens next in the family's case, the court can authorize placement in the home of a relative, again, regardless of the status of a criminal record exemption or resource family approval. In some county court systems, this was the status quo before SB 354. It was recognized that the court had independent judgment to order placement based on its assessment of the health and safety of the home and regardless of the ongoing approval process. So in some counties, this status quo will just continue, but in other counties, this will be a shift and a clarification that changes county practice. As Kim mentioned, placement and approval are different processes. So the placement provisions of SB 354 are fairly straightforward and basically codify the court's existing authority to order placement. Approval is slightly more complicated. So there are SB 354 provisions for all resource family approval applicants, and then there are specific provisions in 354 for relatives specifically. And so this applies to county resource family approval processes, and then it also applies to tribally approved homes. So tribally approved homes, or if the tribe doesn't exercise its right to conduct its own approval process, can request county or CDSS to do it. So for all applicants, there are two significant changes. As for the list of non-exemptable crimes, basically, if the crime is, or the conviction is not exempted under federal law, and has traditionally not been exempted under state law, an individual can request an exemption after 10 years for those state non-exemptable convictions. There's also a simplified exemption process, and the timeframe for that was shortened for all applicants. So before, it was required that the individual not have any misdemeanors within the last 5 years or no felonies within the last 7 years. That was shortened to 3 and 5 years respectively. But the changes for relatives are particularly significant. So it was already law before SB 354 that a resource family applicant could receive child-specific approval, and that was a determination that the resource family approval worker would make based on the prospective resource parents application and kind of the circumstances of that approval process. SB 354 still allows for child-specific approval and says if a relative is eligible for child-specific approval, then the approving agency can grant an exemption for virtually any prior conviction, whether or not it is federally or state non-exemptable. There is a carve-out for very serious convictions within the last 5 years, like child abuse and neglect, spousal abuse, rape, et cetera. But relatives are not subject to that categorical list of exemptions, those absolute bars to exemption in the way that they were before. And then it follows the standard exemption process of showing proof of rehabilitation and good character under existing law. And Kim is going to talk more about how this applies to tribally approved.
So the tribally approved homes, they are also subject to the same background check requirements that are in Health and Safety Code 1522. And the reason for this is to ensure the federal funding so that the 4E funding can be matched there for your families. Under 354, the TAW applicants, they are also eligible to receive that standard or simplified exemption. There's a lot that goes into all these processes. We do have what's called the Background Assessment Guide. BAG is the acronym you may hear about. On the RFA website, we do have a link to the BAG. So when tribes are doing a tribal approved home process with their family, they can look at that for a very detailed, very, I hope, user-friendly guide to help determine if that family is eligible for a simplified or standard exemption and what crimes fall under the non-exemptable list, the exemptable list, because this is very confusing and complicated. But under 354, the TAW applicants can also utilize that simplified or standardized exemption process. And then a little bit, SB 354 did include a little bit of information about AB 686, which we talked about in the last hour. This also applies to the criminal background process, where the counties must work with the tribes to apply the prevailing social and cultural standards into the RFA process. So that was reiterated, and just really wanting to clarify that even within SB 354 of the need to work together. Even when you're looking at the criminal background process and looking at the exemption process to see, is this a situation where the tribe believes a standard in line with their social and cultural standards should be applied to this specific family in this specific situation. And then a little bit about funding. SB 354, because they changed so much about the criminal background check that historically has had an impact on how families were funded. There were a lot of changes into the funding as well. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about emergency caregiver funding that's available to applicants who receive that placement prior to approval. That is still available, and for any reason it's not available, if the family is not eligible for emergency caregiver funding, they would be available if the court has authorized the placement of ARC funding, approved relative caregiver funding. Sorry, got to think of the acronyms again. There are some changes, just as a quick little side note, to the emergency caregiver funding program. Right now, the proposed legislation that is available on the Department of Finance website is looking at the timeframes of 90 days up to 180 days. This is different. If that passes, that is different than the current timeframe that is 120 days up to 365 days. So we could talk more another time, more details about that, and a lot. We will release an all-county letter once the finalized legislation has been passed. If the relative is not eligible, sorry, I'm stumbling a little, for emergency caregiver funding or AFDC-FC, that is the foster care payment after a family is approved that they would receive. If a relative, and that word is specific, when you see relative in terms of SB 354, it's being utilized intentionally versus applicant. So in terms of a relative, if they're not eligible for the EC funding or if the AFDC-FC and the court authorized the placement, they're eligible for funding through ARC. This includes even in situations where the relative was denied approval as a resource family. So they went through the RFA process and they were denied approval. The family can still receive funding. So I think that's an important piece of legislation, a really important part of SB 354 that occurred. We know many times that for whatever reason, they couldn't pass the approval process. And we knew that this was the appropriate placement for a child, and the court agreed and authorized it. And there would not have been funding available prior to SB 354 to that child. Now, one area where they would not be eligible for funding is if they are given guardianship of the child and they were denied approval, they are not eligible for ARC at that point in time. So as the child is going through their journey in the child welfare system, if guardianship is being considered as a permanency option, it's important to really look at that and address that with tribe, with county, with the courts to determine the impact or the consequences of ordering guardianship of a plan. The reason for that is kin gap requires approval. The way the statutes work, you have to be an approved relative caregiver to receive kin gap funding. So that is, we understand, a barrier right now to one of the permanency options available to families. In terms of adoption assistance, it sounds like you talked about that earlier. I think yesterday it was. The relative may be eligible for AAP if adoption is ordered. And I say maybe because the adoption laws, in order to receive AAP, there are some federal requirements of criminal history that some may fall under what can be eligible for AAP and some may not. So if adoption is being considered, it's really important to work with eligibility workers or AP, our adoption policy unit, or the county's adoption policy unit to really determine this criminal history, what impact, even if they're denied approval as a resource family, does that criminal conviction, will that preclude them from being eligible for AAP? So it's really important to look at that ahead of time. So those are two situations where the funding, could be challenging or a little bit problematic, but if you're doing the research and working together ahead of time, that can be addressed. So some other important information that we won't go into a whole lot of detail about with 354 is, again, AB 686. We've talked a lot about that, so won't go over that again. It also clarified that in the resource family approval process that there are no minimum income requirements. We have in the statute that you had to ensure financial stability, and that would also often get confused with requiring some sort of minimum level of income, and that does not. So it provided clarity that the family does not need to have an actual income to be approved as a resource family. And that even though financial stability is required in an applicant, it can be waived on a case-by-case basis. So that provided a lot of clarity for families that may be struggling financially, but they're still the appropriate resource for this child. there's so much that went into SB 354 that we want to have data collection when we want the statute requires a lot of information about what type of data will be collected and gathered to help us analyze and improve SB 354. And we'll be providing information to the legislature on that. We're working right now to determine how to collect that data because some of that information we're not able to receive from CWS CMS right now with resource family applicants or with tribally approved homes. So we'll be working with you, with our tribal partners to ensure how can we get this important information from you to help prepare this legislative report to really improve SB 354. Once we have that information, we're actively working on it right now. We will have a all county letter that is sent out. And so we will get that feedback from everybody in that mechanism there. Okay.
Hello. So we've heard a lot about SB 354, a lot of legalese has been thrown out to you. We also want to leave time for questions, so I may go a little quickly, but we'll see. So I'm talking a little about why, what you heard there was case law and things like that. And many of us here know how important being placed with relatives or our tribal families and our tribal community is, and just wanted to touch on some of the research. What does the research tell us when our youth, our children are placed with our relatives? We see that there's more stability in care. They have more frequent and consistent contact with birth parents and siblings, more likely to remain in their neighborhoods, their schools of origin, really important, more likely to graduate from high school, less likely to run away. And we see fewer negative emotions about being in the system when they're placed with relatives rather than being placed with non-relatives. And I think we can all agree how important these things are in providing stability and lessening the trauma of removing our youth from their families. If we can keep them within their communities, with their tribes, and connected to the things that are most important to them. I thought this was really interesting to look at. There's been research done about placements that are more likely to keep siblings together. And you can see from all ranges, from just 2 siblings all the way up to 6 siblings. When we place youth with family, with kin, the percentage that are able to keep all of those siblings together is exponentially larger. You know, from 78% when it's 2 siblings to 35% with 6 siblings. And we know how hard it can keep our sibling sets together. I've been working on legislation this year on the importance of siblings, you know, that just because we're removing from a parent or a guardian or an Indian custodian to disrupt the entire familial relationship, it can be so damaging. So to see statistics like this really hits home why we work so hard to make relative placements easier and to remove some of the barriers that have always been in place. And I think that's why we're really proud of the work that we're doing with SB 354 and going forward. So now I just a little bit of background on relative preference in general. There's a lot of code sections for the state of California that deal with relative preference. And when we see a relative preference, we are including the tribal definition of relative, which I highlight later in a slide. But there are different stages through a dependency case. In the beginning, what we see when you heard about the preference for emergency placement with relatives or a non-relative extended family member, that falls within the Welfare and Institution Code 309 and 319. You're going to have these slides and presentations, so I won't spend too much time, but just wanted to highlight for everyone where you can find the requirements in the Welfare and Institutions Code. And really important, I think, is looking at the legislative intent language. That, you know, it was the intent of the legislature to preserve and strengthen a child's family ties whenever possible. And that is why there's preferential consideration shall be given whenever possible to the placement of a child with the relative. And again, you know, in the family code that's reiterated, be made in the home of a relative. WIC 361.3, to be placed immediately with the relative. And then also we have case law. Placement with a suitable relative is presumptively in the child's best interest. I don't think that's telling us anything we didn't already know, but now you see it's been codified with case law and in statute. This is a very broad overview of relative defined. So a relative for when we're considering preferential consideration for placement, an adult related to a child by blood, adoption, or affinity within the 5th degree of kinship. And then that goes in and explains all of that and where you can find that in the code. It's a specific legal term, and it means the home shall be the first placement to be considered and investigated. And then it does show you that in 2018, preferential consideration was no longer limited. They did expand it to go out to within the 5th degree. And here's the definition of non-relative extended family member. But what I wanted to focus on is relative under the Indian Child Welfare Act. It is to be defined by the law or custom of the Indian child's tribe. And in the absence of such law or custom, a person who has reached age 18, Indian child's grandparent, aunt or uncle, brother, sister, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, niece or nephew, first or second cousin or step-parent. It's quite an extensive list. And I wanted to highlight that because everything we talked about under SB 354 for relative placement for the Indian Child Welfare Act, this is who's covered by that. So it's quite broad where the criminal exemptions can apply. It is for this list of people. So I'm going to very briefly go through relative placement requirements at each hearing. There are a variety of steps when a child is removed. So first, we're looking at pre-detention to detention. And I just wanted to highlight, so this is right when the child is taken into temporary custody, before they've even possibly become before the court. These are the duties that a social worker has to undertake. You have to consider the relative first. And for tribal communities, it'd be relative as defined within the Indian Child Welfare Act. They have a duty to assess, and that's the emergent placement that was already discussed by Kim and Sabrina. That's the CLETS, the CACI, the home assessment. And then that child may be placed on an emergency basis if those are completed without any further going through. They don't have to meet those higher standards of RFA or a tribally approved home. This is just highlighting the same rules that apply if a youth is coming to the system through the probation arm. So this is authorizing the probation agency to also make emergency placement with a relative before any resource family approval has been done or the tribally approved homes. Again, mimics what's done with the assessment with the CLETS, the criminal background check, the child abuse registry, and the in-home inspection. Now we get to the detention hearing. You come before the judge. The child, if they make the determination at that point, the child cannot be returned home. They have to look at the determination. So if they weren't emergency placed for whatever reason, there's another look. Before we place this child into what we would call stranger care, they need to determine, has a relative stood up? Are they able and willing? And they should be given preferential consideration. Again, doing that initial assessment, not the full-blown assessment, but then they would proceed through either RFA or the tribally approved home. Again, through detention to disposition, when they make a determination, what services are going to be provided to the family, the placement of the child, continued the preferential consideration for placement. So if a relative wasn't found initially in the early stages up through disposition, there's still an obligation to continue to assess any relatives, any extended family members for placement. They must initiate an assessment of any relative, and they have a continuing obligation to locate and identify and locate relatives. And I know in working with our tribal communities, the ongoing obligation to find a connection through the tribes and noticing all available members to hopefully locate a placement within the tribal community. Do you want to give time for questions? Okay, so I believe all these slides are going to be provided to you. We're not going to get through all of them, but thank you for your time. We want to leave some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Julie. I do believe we have a couple minutes for questions, and I just want to say that, as Julie said, that was a lot of legalese. So just to boil it down, what we know is from today is something that we have long known. Research shows that relative placements are often best and are preferred. We know that tribes don't always have access to be able to do those relative placements because we are having access issues to criminal background check information, and so more work needs to be done. SB 354 made some changes in the law that provides a little more flexibility for tribes and other state agencies to make decisions about what crimes that pop up in a criminal background check negate a placement or not. But again, more work is done. Only 21 of 109 tribes in California currently do their own background checks. This process is still open. Tribes can apply through the California Department of Justice to get access to the criminal background check information. And that information is on the DOJ website. We know that tribes still need access to name-based background checks in emergency placements. And so that is something that we continue to work on. And then the definition of relative in SB 354 is something that we are also looking at as a possible fix to work on, because it uses a more narrow definition of relative than what tribal advocates often need and look for in the process. So I just want to say thank you to our panelists. I'm going to hand it over to Joanne, but I just want to recognize Julie comes to us from the Children's Law Center and Sabrina comes to us from the Alliance of Children's Rights, both non-tribal specific child welfare organizations that have been great partners, especially this year through the legislative process, to ensure that their bills and law changes that they are looking at include tribes in a way that honors tribal sovereignty and includes Indian children when and where appropriate. So I just really appreciate both of you being here today to present and just for that partnership. So.
All right, so we just have a few minutes. I want to thank our panelists here for sticking to their time limits. And also just want to make a note that the All County Letter 22-33 is going to provide more information about SB 354. So I see, Michelle, you have your hand up.
We don't know, thank you. We don't know what they're walking into. And that's a real dangerous situation, not to mention what we don't know about homes that we're approving. And so, you know, in 2022, when we're talking about tribal sovereignty and self-determination, you know, why is the Department of Justice holding tribes out of CLETS when it really is important for us to do this work? So that is something I think we really need to push on. And I know that was a recommendation in the report that came out, and it's really serious. We've been talking about this. I've been practicing for 17 years and we've been talking about it. It's done. We're done talking. We really need actions. So, and I know Mary just stepped out and with the DOJ's office, and so I will definitely continue to hammer her on this, but it's, love you, Mary. But it's a real issue on the ground for tribes, and I hope people can hear that. I also had some questions on what 1460 allows me to do, right? I get it, it allows me to approve a home for placement, right? I get that, that's not my question. And I've tried to get some clarification, but DOJ is just not helping me a whole lot. But in the application, it says, or an employee of a tribal agency who may have contact with a child, right? So that's somebody else I understand I could background. But I wanted to understand, what is tribal agency? It's not defined. right? Does that mean only my Child and Family Services Department or any agency of the tribe? Because I view agency meaning arm of the tribe that has contact with children. And specifically, we have a tribal school on our reservation. And I want to know, can we use our background authority to screen those individuals who have contact with children? And I can't get a good answer. So if anybody can help clarify that for me, because we do want to institute, a really stringent background screening process for anybody who has contact with our children. And so I think that is something that's just being ignored, like what is actually going on in tribal communities. And then I'm not quite sure where this fits, but my worker raised this with me. And since we're talking about what really is California's relative placement preference, we do have situations in which we might have a tribal child that has siblings that aren't tribal. And, the WIC section wouldn't give us information on those kids. So how can we keep siblings together if we don't have data on all of the sibling units? So just wanted to throw that out as a practical barrier sometimes for tribes to try to keep siblings in the same home because we just don't have information on that. So those are my points I wanted to raise, and hopefully we can get some answers and some movement, particularly on CLETS. It's a real problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. You raised some really important points. I know I work with Indian Child Family Preservation Program, one of the few, if only, agencies that is doing their own criminal background checks, and they have the similar struggles. Unfortunately, we are over time now for questions and answers. But I hope and know that the state representatives that are here are noting the concerns, and there needs to be further dialogue, obviously, with Department of Justice. And my personal thought is, what's that saying about better to not ask the question and beg for forgiveness later than to get permission for something when you have a gray area. So I do welcome anyone to speak individually with the panelists to get answers to their questions. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time, but I want to respect the next panel and not eat into their time. So thank you, everyone, and thank you again to our panelists.
Again, thank you to the panel. We appreciate the information. Thank you for the questions. This conference needs to be more than just speaking heads. It needs to be learning and listening about what the problems are and what the potential solutions are. So while the next panel is coming up, I just want to encourage you not to take no for an answer. When you know there's a good placement, you know there are options. If you take no for an answer, nothing changes. I appreciate the attorney from Pechanga who expressed some frustration, to put it mildly. We need to express that in individual cases and at policy level to get those things fixed. And I want to tell you that success is possible. There's a tribe in southern Utah, pre-COVID, had a 97% placement rate within their tribe for 8 years. But they chose to recruit differently. And I'd be happy to talk with anybody about that later and connect you with the director of that program. COVID has strained their ability. I think last time I talked to them after COVID, I think their placement rate is down to 92%. So the next panel, I only see one person up here. Are you the one-person panel? They're all virtual. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Judge Thorne. All right, well, we queue up the next panelists. They are all virtual. We had some travel challenges and changes, and some are joining us all the way from Minnesota. So we have some virtual panelists that we're queuing up. Those panelists include Dave McDowell, who is the Chief of the Children's Services Quality Management Branch at CDSS, Dave started at CDSS in 2008, and prior to that, he studied children's family and peer relationships and their impact on their social and emotional development in his PhD program. So Dr. McDowell, thank you and welcome. We also have a team of folks joining us from the Department of Minnesota Human Services. This team that joins us includes Rihanna Jacobs, Richie Smith, and Marvin Davis, who all work within the ICWA unit in the Minnesota Department of Health. And then we have Sheldon Spotted Elk, who is the Senior Director of Judicial National Engagement at Casey Family Programs. Sheldon is a member of the Northern Cheyenne Tribe and has both a JD and a degree in social work, which he has put to use as an advocate in tribal law, child welfare, and juvenile law for many years. He has a special focus on cultural humility and ethics in children's representation. And so we're very thrilled for these panelists joining us today. They're going to share more with us about ICWA compliance and what that looks like in different forms. So Dr. McDowell will tell us some of the ICWA compliance efforts happening at CDSS. The Minnesota team will share some of their ICWA compliance efforts so we can start thinking about some new and different ideas of how that might look for us here in California. And then Sheldon is going to tell us about a study that he recently worked with several tribes in several different states on that shows that ICWA compliance, or ICWA when it is complied with, really works. And we see a lot of successes from that. So I will hand it over to Dr. McDowell from here. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you for the welcome and thank you for having me today. I had intended on joining everybody in person. I did have some travel issues, so instead I am joining you today from the ancestral lands of the Susunis tribe of the Patwin people, a southern branch of the Wintun Nation, up in Northern California in the Bay Area. So I do want to talk to you a little bit today about different things that we're doing at the Department of Social Services to try to improve ICWA compliance and to understand a little bit better about where some of the challenges lie. So what you're looking at now is where did we start? So the Children and Family Services Division had a reorganization in the spring of 2021. That was a wholesale reorganization, so it didn't affect just parts of the division that were concerned with ICWA issues, but we were able to take that opportunity to create a new unit, which is the Children's Services Inquiry and Response Unit. Previously, this had been one person who was responsible for our social worker empowerment hotline. And what we realized was we were getting a lot of information, we were getting concerns and worries from the tribal community about ICWA performance, about individual case things. And so we decided to have what we call the CSER be responsible for some of that work as well. And so recognizing that we needed more than one person, we did create an entire unit. And what you see here are the people who have been very instrumental in getting this unit up and running and helping us get our ICWA hotline ready to roll. And so Kate Nicholas, Emily, Denise, and Kari have all, like I said, been really rock stars in making sure that we have all the pieces in place, developing the proposal, and making sure that we engage everybody appropriately so that this is successful from the launch. You'll see at the bottom of this slide that we did do collaboration with the Tribal Advisory Committee to develop that program proposal, and we are continuing to engage and refine the program proposal. We should be done actually this week sometime. So, okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so we do have our program proposal, which is developed and approved by the CDSS leadership. We have already completed the development of the contact center and the ICWA hotline email box. That virtual contact center is essentially the phone line and the integration of that with some data management systems. So the nice thing is that once we get everybody on board with the plan and it works for everybody, we have the technology pretty much ready to roll. We also have the CSER tracker, so we'll be able to track the concerns that come in. And we'll also be able to use that to collect some data about the frequency, trends in types of concerns that come in, and of course, what the results are once we do get cases in. And you see Emily here, we have now hired somebody who is our lead analyst for the ICWA hotline. And she is familiar with ICWA issues and becoming more familiar with ICWA issues every day. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we have received the ICWA proposal feedback from both counties and tribal representatives, and we are working to finalize that this week. We do have a lot of moving parts internally, but it really is so important to make sure that our Office of Tribal Affairs and others have a chance to look at it before we call it all good. We will be providing a formal response to tribes and tribal representatives based on the consultation that was done. Again, because of the review and some of the legal issues that we wanted to make sure we were sound on, we needed a little bit of extra time on that. All right, so the next steps. What we're ready to do is we're developing the response letter. We will provide a new draft of our program proposal. We do expect the ICWA hotline to be launched in September of 2022. And obviously, if there are questions, you can reach out to me. You can reach out to the Office of Tribal Affairs through their inbox for tribal consultation. So that's the ICWA hotline. And I do want to mention a couple of other things really quickly before we move on in the panel. So my branch is also responsible for the CCFSR, the California Child and Family Services Review. And that's the county self-assessments, system improvement plans, and our ongoing monitoring. We're also looking at ways in which we can improve that process for ICWA compliance by ensuring that tribes are at the table from the beginning of the process. So we spend a lot of time working with counties to prepare for them to launch their peer reviews and to complete their self-assessment. And so we are going to make a concerted effort to make sure that tribes are part of that from the beginning and not involved at the last minute as getting a letter to participate in as a stakeholder when the larger peer review and CSA occurs. So hopefully folks will see that coming very quickly as counties are rolling out according to their regular schedule. We do have an ACIN, an all county information notice, that lists what counties are going through the process and what stage they're in. I don't have that number, but I can certainly get that out to folks, the ACIN number. And so I would also encourage folks to look at that and see which counties are coming up to make sure that you're aware that somebody might be tapping you on the shoulder and asking you to participate. All right, so those are the major things that we're doing at the state regarding specific oversight issues. There have been a couple of legislative proposals that we're also looking at. We're always open to other suggestions. We've had really great dialogue over the last couple of years on our federal reporting, the annual progress and services report, and the Child and Family Services Plan. We are embarking on round 4 of our federal Child and Family Services review coming up next year. And so we're already doing planning for that, and we will likely be reaching out to tribes and tribal representatives as we prepare for that. So thank you for your time this morning.
I don't see Michelle. Not sure who's up next. On the list, we have Rena Jacobs.
Yes, hi. I think we're getting queued up with our folks from Minnesota. Richie, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
yes, we can hear you. Do you
right.
want us to run your slide or are you good to run it yourself?
If you can run my slide, if I just say slide, if you can switch it, that'd be great.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yep. And I just got to throw in a little hand thing. I love Judge Thorne. His advice has always been great. He always said, if you're looking for family placement, always make sure that the child is cared for, safe, and loved. That's the best things that a child will always remember. Even if there's an elder, those 2 years that that child will be with, that could be the thing that will ground them. So I had to throw that little plug in there. So, all right. Hello, guys. My name is Richie Smith. I'm with DHS, the Indian Child Welfare Compliance Unit. I like to think that we're kind of special. I used to be with the ICWA Advisory Board with 11 tribes in the state of Minnesota. So now I'm on the other side with the state. It's a little different, but I am fine with doing that. It's like walking in two worlds. Let's see, exit full screen. Okay, I'm going to slide 2, please. So, as you can see, the people that are with me right now, it's Carrie Owens, me, Richie Smith from Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, Cindy and Rihanna Jacobs, which is our supervisor. We all do the compliance review process for the ICWA unit. Slide 3. The guides that we work with, of course, the ICWA Indian Child Welfare Act. We work with our own act, Minnesota Indian Family Preservation Act, and that this sets a higher standard for us. I always like to say, like, if you're enrolled, it's like some enrolled in Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, but I also have affiliations with, let's say, the Bad River tribe of Wisconsin. MIFPA notices have to be sent out to that tribe too, even though if I'm enrolled, because I could have family members there. So we like to use it. It's like extras. It's a safety net, to find family members. So even if there's this year, there's eligible for membership, we send out all MIFPA notices to that tribe. And we also work with the tribal state agreement. Let's see here. We'll go to number 4. This is the part where I like talking about. This is the DHS ICWA compliance process. We have the complaint process. That's just kind of where anyone that's in the court system can send a complaint to our DHS unit, and we'll review it to see if they are found out of compliance. That doesn't have a lot of teeth to that, though. The main part here I want to talk about, though, is our ICWA compliance review process, Minnesota statute 477A-0126. This actually has teeth to it. This part here is like, let's see if I go through the process here. When I say teeth, it means like if the county is found 2 years out of compliance following the ICWA MIFPA laws, they will be deducted 50% of the aid that comes from the state will be deducted from them, meaning that they'll only get 50% of their money, the aid and stuff like that. So that's one of the biggest things that I'm hoping that someone here in California will use. I think it's a thing where actually the counties have to take notice to. If you're found out of compliance 2 years in a row, you will lose 50% of the aid to the counties. Yeah, let's go to section 5, slide 5, please. Here's the county aid. The ICWA MIFPA review stems from the Minnesota legislation around 2017 to offset the cost of foster care Indian children. The department was charged with developing and implementing the ICWA MIFPA case review system to monitor and evaluate county agencies' performance and implementation practices. So consultation with counties, identified with the county attorneys, the tribes, and the ICWA Advisory Board developed a review tool process to develop what we'd be looking for to see if the counties were following the ICWA MIFPA laws. And we have 6 provisions that we follow with. One quick point is, I know we have to get to this fast, but I was actually opposed to this statute. We looked at this as like a kind of like a bounty for our kids. We're saying, well, we're going to give the county extra money for this, for taking our children away from us. We had an elder say they're doing it again, meaning like the boarding schools, taking our children away from us. So what happened with this statute right before it was passed in the Senate, they put on this caveat for me getting this job is like we would review the process of the counties to make sure that they are following the ICWA MIFPA laws, and if they are found out of compliance, then they would lose their 50% of the money. So it's funny how that all worked out. Here I testified in the Senate saying, hey, this is not a good law and stuff, but then they changed it So we're able to do that. So I think it's actually worked out for the better part. Slide 6, please. The provisions review, when we're doing our compliance review, it's inquiry, asking the mom, dad, child, if the child's age appropriate, if they have any tribal affiliations. We look and see if the counties have sent out the MIFA notice, the Minnesota Indian Family Preservation Act. They have 24 hours to send out this notice to the tribes to notify that if they screen an assessment for one of our native children. Of course, the ICWA notice, we make sure that the ICWA notice has been sent out. ICWA notices have to be in 10 days before we have an admit deny hearing. So you have to continue it. We also look and see this active efforts. This is kind of like a gray area because you're looking, active efforts is kind of like, you're looking to see if the child, if they found the family members, did they contact the tribe? Did they reach out to the tribe for out-of-home placement plans? And also we look for a qualified expert witness, QEW, to make sure that the tribe support out-of-home placement. And 6 is placement preference. We're always looking sure that the county reached out to the tribe asking for their guidance about where this child and their family members, where this child can be placed, because we want to have those children placed with some kind of family member or relative. Let's see. And number 7, slide 7, please. The review of the system. Cases are selected randomly, pulled through SSIS, the social service system, by county agencies. The children is identified as being under age 18. It's an Indian child. Foster care payments from previous calendar year from the review is for a child for out-of-home placement. And let's see. So those are kind of our requirements, what we do. The county agency is identified as the lead agency, meaning the child's under the state court jurisdiction, not tribal court. In some instances and cases are reviewed until transferred to tribal court. Once it transfers to tribal court, then we stop our review percentages. Let's see what I got for you here. Let's see. In 2017, when we first did this review, it was just like a baseline. So it was just, there was no money taken on that. We want to see how the counties were doing. In 2019, we pulled 5% of the cases. In 2020, we did 10% of the cases. In 2021, we did 10%. And this year in 2022, we pulled 15% of the cases. Let's see. And we can go to, and then you can see in the review system, this is the percentages what we do. I didn't read this part up top here for you, but it shows like we have a timeline. We have to, we send out notices to the counties in January to let them know we're going to be reviewing your case, have this case ready. So all your notes are ready and have that prepared. And then we start reviewing in early February. And we work through February through, I say June, pretty much. You can go to slide 8, please. Here, it shows our review timeline. I knew I was going ahead of myself. You see January here's communication goes with the counties. February's review starts. May, and when, if we can't find information like inquiry, did they ask inquiry? Did they send out a MIFA notice, a Minnesota Indian Family Preservation Act notice? We'll ask for that and ask for that. And if they have it, that's great. If not, then they are found out of compliance. So that's one of the things that we do. Let's see, I kind of jumped ahead here, sorry. Go to slide 8. Reviews. Yeah, okay, there we go. Sorry, a little technical difficulty here. Slide 8. Let's see, January, February, yeah, then slide 9. There we go. Now I'm back with you. Okay, so once they're found out of compliance, there could be there's a fiscal withhold. Example, if it's 2 years out of compliance, then they'll be withhold 50% of whatever money they're expecting to get. And that opens the eyes to the county saying, hey, we got to follow the ICWA, the MIFA laws and stuff like that, contact the tribes. It's really, it's an important thing. If the county's found out of compliance 2 consecutive years, is 50% of the hold, which would normally receive we have to go through the Department of Revenue, determine the amount allocated to the county agency from the formula, determine the statute to purchase compliance. This is done through, and then how we do it is how we receive compliance, and we have it's called a PIP. So it's through technical assistance. We go through and we review with the counties kind of what the county should be doing. Like if they failed with inquiry, MIFA notice, and ICWA notice. We'll do a PIP on them, a program improvement plan it's called. And we'll say, this is what you should be doing to reach 100% compliance. Right now, it is 100% compliance to receive this aid. The tribes wanted this. They deserve this. They're saying if they're going to get extra money for removing our children, we want 100% compliance. A lot of counties are feeling like this is not fair, but if you look at our side, you're saying it is fair because we've just been an up battle for many years for taking our children out, and you should be able to follow the ICWA MIFA law since we've been around since 1978. Let's see here. You can go to slide 10, please. Like as I said before, technical assistance programs, what we do is we do tech assistance, kind of like this. I'll like reach out to counties and we'll talk about the 6 provisions. We also have like a coffee talk, which is really great. It's kind of like where they'll listen to us and we'll talk about the 6 provisions, and the counties can come in, they can talk, and they learn a lot of things like that. We've had a lot of good responses from that, from the counties listening to us about inquiry, MIFA notice, and we'll bring up scenarios and stuff like that. So that's good. And we also have like it's called CRM. If you're at DHS, we have acronyms beyond unbelievable. But CRM is customer relations management, and you can send in questions about, if you have a question about inquiry, MIFA notice, and going like that. Let's see here. Now let's talk about the program improvement plan. That's right here. What we do with the counties. And then let's see, this is the view outcomes here. You can see here, it's kind of small for me to read, but in 2018, you can see it in the dark blue. This is percentages that are coming in at. Like I said, the outcomes were 49% in 2018 baseline. And then now in the new, we just did our review, so we don't have our most update information, but they came in at 85%. So it's a big improvement to see what they're doing. And the main things that I would say that the main 3 provisions that the counties do not get the best all the time is inquiry, asking if the child is affiliated to American Indian tribe, sending out that MIFA notice within the 24-hour screen assessment, and also the ICWA notice. They send out the ICWA notice like 1 day before the midnight hearing. We know we can't do that. So those are the main things that we are pushing in. I think those are some easy black and white things to teach, but it's been sometimes, there's other factors to come in on that. Let's see, we can go to number 12. And this is just our resources for non-compliance. I was talking about in bulletins, and let's see, I think that might be it. I was trying to go a little fast for you, so hopefully it's okay. See, and this is our brochure. And I think that's it. So I just want to say miigwech, that's Lakota. I'm Ojibwe, so I say miigwech, but just want to say thank you.
All right, thank you, Richie. Do we have Sheldon online?
Yes, I'm here. I'm having a hard time putting my camera on. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Can I have the rest of the time?
You do. We have time for Q&A at the end if you have time, but take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. Yep. Pivot Walnut. Good morning, my friends. I'm Northern Cheyenne. I'm calling in from Denver, Colorado. And the greeting response to that is actually pivot. So if I was there, I'd make you guys do a call back, and I'd say pivot walnut, and you would say, you'd do a sideways karate chop, and you would say pivot. And that's how you greet each other in Cheyenne. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about ICWA courts. I'm going to talk to you about this really cool report. I actually have a couple other reports to talk to you about ICWA courts and how they've effectuated change, not only with compliance, but also adaptive change. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So adaptive change in a lot of places. And so we want to get both of those things. We want to get technical change, and we track that with data, and we track that with numbers. And sometimes there's check sheets to do that, but we also need adaptive change, the way that people think about things. And of course, as we all know, ICWA is both the hearts and minds, the black letter of the law and the spirit of the law. So how do we really capture that? The other thing I'd make you do if I was there in person is make you guys call back. I am an agent of change, because I feel like that is what's requisite for us to effectuate positive change in our tribal communities and be able to change the state court systems and state lawyers and state social workers in the way that they see the love that our people bring, Indigenous peoples brings into this world. And so I want all of us to be artists, artists of living. And so that's what I hope that we all could be. I'm actually wearing my Sitting Bull t-shirt today because he was the ultimate artist of living. And so I'm going to do a share screen, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some numbers here. The first screen I'm going to share. And so these are the 2020 AFGARs, and these are all the states that currently have disproportionality. And you can look at, there's a lot of red states there that have disproportionality all over the country. Right now we have currently 17 ICWA courts, and ICWA courts are, and I'll tell you more about what they are, and then I'm going to talk about this data report that came up. But ICWA courts are a strategy to safely reduce the amount of kids in foster care. And so we have a couple of reports that verify that. And so you look at where this is happening in California, of course, you currently are experiencing a disproportionality in your system. You guys have 2 ICWA courts in your state as well. So that is something, maybe a strategy that we look to build more in California. How do we build more ICWA courts? How do we start that development? How do we engage the court system? And how do we engage lawyers in that process of adaptive change, not only technical change? Of course, you guys already know all this, that ICWA is the gold standard of child welfare. I'm pretty proud of this graphic art that I put together in this slideshow. But this is what I think of when I think of why the gold standard is, that we fight with active efforts to keep a child within these concentric circles. We know that resiliency exists inside these concentric circles, and when ICWA is complied with, we see that active efforts to prevent removal, that this case would never even go to court. But if it does go to court, that we look to active efforts to reunify. If that's not safely possible, we're looking for relatives and kin. It's our values that brought this to the nation. It's our values that brought this gold standard, this humanity to the child welfare system. So there is some power, I feel like, exists with all of us Indigenous peoples that are on this call, that are in the audience. It's our values that brought this. And of course, this all happens within a community and a cultural context. So the importance of connectedness, us being able to connect with human beings, us being able to connect with the earth. That was so important to all of our ways of life, that we do ceremonies every year to renew that, you know. And so this is really a key aspect of our worldview. And so what are we doing with ICWA courts? How do we effectuate this? And I'm going to breeze through this really quick so I can get to you the data component of what I'm supposed to do today. These are the 5 principles of an ICWA court: judicial leadership, data collection. How are we tracking that? Right now, we don't currently have uniform data collection over the 17 ICWA courts that exist throughout the country. And I don't necessarily think we need to necessarily, because a lot of jurisdictions sometimes will look to different data markers to address the issues that they're working on. I don't think we need 17 data projects in all the jurisdictions. It'd be great to have one, but if we're prioritizing our resources, there might be other places to prioritize that, and I'll give those recommendations at the very end. Training, of course, we should know the law. We should know the spirit of the law, the reason why this is about. There's importance of the historical context. The number one reason, a spoiler alert on everything I'm going to do, this is the biggest takeaway, the biggest indication of why ICWA courts work, are tribal stakeholder engagement. And so that is the number one reason right here. Number 4 is that we need to engage tribes that appear most in your jurisdiction. Proximity is also a value. So who are those courtroom actors, and how do we get their input? How do we gain insight of some of the barriers that are currently existing to ICWA implementation into your jurisdiction? I'll tell you, it's different among all 17 ICWA courts. Some places struggle with inquiry and notice. Some places struggle with active efforts. Some places struggle with transfer. It really kind of depends on what ICWA court we're talking about. And then, of course, we want people to have adaptive ways that they're coming into court. We want gold standard lawyers. We want gold standard judges. We want solution-oriented social workers. We want people that are seeing the highest of humanity in this process. And And so that's really key to gaining positive outcomes. And so just a little bit of a brag on all these cool ICWA courts out there. Like I said, 17, there's about, and this is all self-reported, among the 17 ICWA courts, there's about 3,000 children that are within those ICWA courts, and that's self-reported from the 17 jurisdictions that we're working with. There is a significant impact, and we'll talk about that, but generally, I'll give you it right now, we're seeing higher rates of reunification, lower rates of termination of parental rights, higher rates of placement preferences. So we almost see that immediately, like within the first few months of ICWA courts coming to be. So there is an aspect of changing the psychology, changing the way that we view these things, the way that we approach the work. So we almost see those results almost immediately when ICWA courts start, actually. Some of the other cool things that we, so about, I think 2014, there was only 2 ICWA courts in the whole country. So LA County, they've had an ICWA court for a long, long time. Hennepin County up in Minnesota has kind of been back and forth of having an ICWA court, and then St. Louis County, which is Duluth, Minnesota, started their ICWA court. So there's 2 or 3 ICWA courts throughout the country at this time. And we are starting to get more courts come on and showing interest. We held this first ever ICWA court collaborative. So we brought the jurisdictions in. There's 50 people there, 4 jurisdictions. It was just like we created space for sharing just what's working, what struggles. And so quickly though, we went from that to now we have a 17. And if we hosted it, and we're trying to host a ICWA court collaborative, we're gonna have to turn people away just because there's gonna be that many people there. And us be able to do it safely. But almost immediately, Billings, here's Billings Gazette. You know, we've been in the news quite a bit with ICWA courts. You can see there's uptake in kinship placement and tribally approved homes that we see that they're documenting. The work of trying to change the hearts of social workers and lawyers of being able to find culturally relevant services and culturally relevant communities. We've won awards. This is the Denver and Adams County ICWA courts winning an award at NCJ FCJ's annual conference, the courts conference. Here's the Washington Post has featured ICWA courts. We've done panels at plenary sessions of many different conferences, almost everyone that you could be at. Denver Post has featured us. Pima County, we've been on NPR down in Pima County. And Pima County just recently won a cool award down in Arizona. So there's a lot of great momentum around this. It's a contagious idea. It's a sticky idea that's going out there. And this is the reason why. And this is the report that Michelle kind of talked a little bit about. I'm going to talk to you about Pima's report as well. So this report was done by the Capacity Building Center for Courts. The primary research on this is Alicia Summers. A lot of ICWA, cool ICWA data stuff is done by Alicia Summers. She does a really great job. The thing that I think is really significant of this report, they assessed 5 ICWA courts. So they went around and got baseline data. And so because Minnesota actually had a lot of baseline data already, they were able to do immediately an analysis, a comparison actually. This is a lot of the ways that we use data. So there, of course, there's a shortage in ICWA data. You know, like you might ask your local judge, like, hey, how many ICWA cases do you have? They might not even know that actually. So they don't have a data tracking system within their court system. Sometimes the agency doesn't even have a data system that they could accurately tell you how many cases they currently have at any time. And so this is a big area that we kind of struggle with, especially if we're meeting with the jurisdiction for the first time. And so how do we use the data in an adaptive way? So there's something called the root cause analysis. That's another strategy that we could use. Court of Appeals, like how many Court of Appeals decisions? That's a data point for us. And some of this is also not only the quantifiable aspects of the numbers, but also the quality. So we interview judges, we interview lawyers, we interview the social workers. Most importantly, we interview the tribes, we interview the parents that are going through the process to find out what their experience is. If we're going to design an ICWA court, we need to design it with that empathy in mind. But one of the 2 most significant data markers that we have on this, as you look at this, the ones in red, is that a tribe being present at the shelter hearing, at the initial hearing, so in some jurisdictions that was 72 hours, So that means they're not, those that know the process, and I'm sure everybody here does. So you think about that, what's happening if they're already there at the initial hearing? They're not responding to a legal notice. They're not responding to the notice there. They know that ICWA court's on Tuesday. They're there handling their cases. And here comes a family in the room, and they're there at the front end of those cases to help solve culturally relevant services, help solve active efforts, help solve placement preferences if needs be. I think the culture of some of these courtrooms have been significant as far as changing it to where there is solution-oriented focuses. And we're seeing great results of that. As a result, almost 4 months, it shortens the period of a child being in the foster care system by 4 months, which is a significant thing. So court systems, state court systems, you need to build collaborative relationships of trust with tribes. I know there's a history here of why when the state or the government knocks on your door and says, here, we're here to help, there's a reason why tribes say, get the hell off my porch. And so you need to know that. You need to know that trauma-informed history, and you need to work and build that relationship of trust, because there's some key significant outcomes that happen because of it. And that's a big thing that we focus in on. The other report that I'll add, and I'll make sure that we have time for questions, is that this was recently done. And if you actually just type in Google, and I can even put in the chat for those that are looking at it, this is the Pima County ICWA Court data report. So just recently came back. This is only a few months old. So there's sometimes this myth that happens, and I've seen it in other reports, but sometimes there's this myth that says, oh, ICWA takes so much longer to actually comply with. It actually delays permanency. It's going to make everything much longer, actually, and so it's really hard. This report actually busts that myth, and so Pima County is reunifying at a higher rate, and they're actually case closure at a higher, so they're closing those cases quicker with ICWA compliance, rather than it taking so long, so this is a big thing, a significant thing. There's a couple other data aspects if we had. It'd be cool if you're interested in doing this, and maybe in the future, we bring in some of these judges that have led some of these data efforts in their jurisdiction. If we brought in Catherine Begay, who's the only native judge on an ICWA court right now in Albuquerque, New Mexico, the 2nd District, she has significant data as far as placement preferences, reduction and termination of parental rights. Billings, Montana they've only had one TPR in the 5 years that their ICWA court has happened. Denver, likewise, higher placement preferences, higher rates of reunification, higher rates of kin placement, way higher than the state averages. And so these are just anomalies that they're seeing in some of these jurisdictions that are way higher than the state averages that they have for all children. And here's my Denver court right here. And so one of the cool things, and maybe we've even shared this with you, the background picture of this is up at Wounded Knee, actually. And so part of the ceremony of starting an ICWA court in Denver and Adams County, for my tribe, very specifically, if you're going to do ceremony, you have to have intentions. What's your intention? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you doing ceremony? And so that's really important for us to be able to clear that out. And it was really cool for me to be able to travel with 2 judges and 13 lawyers and go up to visit tribes and being intentional in that way that we're trying to make change. We're trying to be change agents in the way that we effectuate ICWA and make sure that we're capturing it the way that it was envisioned. And so we actually went up there, we did ceremony. We went to a sweat lodge the night before on my Northern Cheyenne and Laneville, Montana. And those are our prayer ties that we tied at the cemetery of Wounded Knee. A heavy day, actually, reflecting on a really heavy day. And our intentions, it signified to me that all of our intentions were pure when we're trying to go and do this work and try to effectuate change. And so there's hiccups. We're getting appealed. We get remanded often. The biggest issue that I feel like anecdotally that we're getting remanded on is actually inquiry. That's the reason to know standard. And so that's a big issue for some of these ICWA courts still that we're struggling with. Notice is, of course, the big issue of remand and appeal. So we're not perfect. We're not nailing everything. We're working towards that adaptive change that's happening right now in all child welfare, to be able to decolonize child welfare. And so this is a lot of, I mean, I know I'm leaving a lot out there. It'd be really great for you to read those reports. I can put them in the chat box if you want to deep dive on them. If you want to reach out to me, I'll put my email in the chat box too. Please reach out and we'll have a conversation about this. But that's really the last thing I'll leave you is with some good Cheyenne language too, as in Cheyenne, and my Cheyenne's a little bit rusty here. You're going to say you talk with a big cowboy accent, and I probably do. But I'll say it in Cheyenne first, and I'll translate this. In Cheyenne, it goes, and what that means in Cheyenne is that means it's a proverb. It's a wise saying. It means that all of us are going to encounter struggles in our journey. It's not that struggle that's going to define us. It's the tenacity that we approach that struggle. That's going to ultimately define who we are. And I feel like our grandchildren are going to judge us by that. They're going to look back and say, oh, what did you do in that time? When George Floyd happened, what were you doing? When there was almost ×3 disproportionality for Native children and child welfare, what were you doing in that? I feel like our grandchildren are going to ask those questions, and we're going to be judged by the tenacity and the love and the humanity that we approach those things in. So I wish I was there with you, my friends, but I'll leave it open with questions for all of us.
Thank you so much, Sheldon and Richie and Rihanna and Dr. McDowell, for sharing that. We heard, of course, from California and Minnesota state agencies what they are doing to both get closer to ICWA compliance and measure ICWA compliance. And then, of course, we heard from Sheldon that when we do comply with ICWA, we see a lot of successes, especially when tribes are involved early in cases. So at this time, we do have time for questions. I'd like to open it up for audience questions. I will also be looking in the chat. I would also like to ask a CTFC member to come up and run a mic if we have audience questions. Does anyone have a question for any of the panelists this morning?
Hey, I do have one. This is Richie. I do have one for our Minnesota statute I was talking about. One thing, if you guys do decide to go with that statute, in our statute, it says substantial compliance, which is not, I'm not the lawyer and stuff like that, but means that not 100%. So you should have strict compliance. That's what I would do, just to throw in, to strengthen it up and kind of go that route.
Thanks, Richie. I appreciate that. Oh, I see a question here from Aviva. Panelists, we have a question coming here from the audience.
Good morning. I wanted to ask you both, and maybe particularly Sheldon, about establishing ICWA courts. As you know, we have 2 here in California, one in LA County and one in Sacramento County now, but it's just so helpful to see that there's data being collected on those in other states, and that shows that they work and reduce the timelines and increase tribal participation. So I was wondering if you could share any suggestions or tips for getting those courts started and pointing folks to, you know, where that data would be, that we can use it to advocate for those courts being established. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you so much for that question. Recently, and I feel like this has been a very successful strategy, is we've been partnering with court improvement, so your state court improvement programs. And so there's a few states that have now included this into their federally reporting requirements, that they want to develop more ICWA courts in their jurisdiction. And so we've done summits in those jurisdictions, and those summits have been really great recruitment efforts. but also a place where we could build a community of practice. Really is really what we're aiming to build. Of course, ICWA courts in our system, we need a judge. And so every court has a judge. So we're always trying to talk to judges. And in some jurisdictions, I'll tell you, bringing in a specialty court, we find out sometimes in some state jurisdictions, you have to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get the thumbs up to get a specialty court. And then in some jurisdictions, it's just frankly, hey, I'm a judge of this county, I'm a judge of this district, I'm gonna start an ICWA court tomorrow. And here's some things that I need to be considerate of. A couple other steps just to be in that thought process. Proximity, there's power in that proximity, of course, to rip Brian Stevenson's words. So how could we get some of those proximate players, if you will, the ones that are appearing most in court? So this is a court exercise. We want lawyers, we want that county attorney. A lot of ICWA responsibilities is on county attorneys, you know, so we're trying to engage county attorneys. We're trying to engage the parental bench, parental defender bench, the bar, excuse me, children's attorneys. CASA in some jurisdictions are significant players, you know, and so really trying to understand who needs to be at the table. And then key to that, of course, is tribes. The biggest thing that we're seeing data-wise is how can we bring tribes to the table in a meaningful way? It's not just platitudes, but we need them in a meaningful way and being able to build relationships of trust and then provide space for tribes to lead. And so those are some significant steps that need to be taken. The other thing that we usually do, like I'm working with a couple of jurisdictions right now, is we try to do peer-to-peer opportunities. There is a court administrative component to this as well. And so some courts are courts of general jurisdiction, meaning they might have a civil docket in the morning, and then their child dependency cases in the afternoon, and the next day it's a criminal docket. So how are they able to administer? And maybe there's 7 judges within that district. So how are we getting all those ICWA cases, those reason to know cases to the ICWA courts? And how are we carving out enough time for us to be able to handle these cases with the appropriateness that they need to be handled by. So there's kind of a lot of behind the scenes stuff that sometimes you have to navigate, but it's really trying to create a community of practice and identifying judges that can help build this vision. So.
Great, thank you, Sheldon. And can you point our audience members in the direction of resources if they were interested in pursuing that or looking more into it?
Yeah, we almost have all the resources on. If you Google ICWA courts, the first thing that should come to the very top of your Google machine there is ICWA courts by NCJ/FCJ. So there's a landing page at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And we try to keep that updated and regularly posted all the time on it. So we have a blog section on there. There's resources on there. There's some of this research that I cited here that is on it as well. So please look that up. And if you have any questions, please, my email's on that as well. So if you have any questions, you're like, hey, I need to find some more stuff, please reach out to me as well.
Thank you. Are there any other audience questions for any of the panelists?
Just to chime in one thing on what Sheldon said, relationships is such a big important if you're trying to gather information and actually going to the tribes and meeting them. I mean, it's been over 20 plus years. And when I first started out, I was ICWA guardian litem, or CASA, as you put it. I went to the tribes up there and I met with them and I developed a relationship with them. And I've had that relationship for many, many years now to come. So I always meet with the tribes and always, what their thoughts are, what their views are and stuff like that. If I want to throw in one key thing, since we talked about CASA, I think that is like the missing thing for that affects ICWA. You need to have an ICWA guardian litem, which I call their ICWA CASA, that protects the best interest of the Indian child by looking out for their political status. That's one of the main things that in all the big court cases, there's always like a CASA or ICWA or a non-ICWA guardian litem, like looking out just for the child's best interest. We're looking for the best interest of the child, keeping the child and the tribe together. So just keep that in mind. We have that in Minnesota and it's been growing pretty big. So. And if I could say one more thing, just we're talking about the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's talking about like they always say that we don't know family members. We don't keep track of family members. Well, they do actually, because there's 2 sides of the BIA. There's one where they have like land fraction land and stuff like that, where they say, like if my family has been fractionized land like 10, 20%. Well, if you get those documents, it shows every family member of your family in that fractionized land. So I just want to bring that up. That's my little soapbox thing. So if anyone's looking for family members, we quit.
Thanks, Richie. I also want to, you mentioned the relationship piece that Sheldon brought up too, that it's really important to do that relationship building. It's important for state agencies or ICWA courts or whatever the agency is to build those relationships with tribes. And I understand that in Minnesota, you all provide funding for tribes to be able to engage in that work. Can you tell us a little more about that?
The funding, like the ICWA Advisory Board and stuff, what are you talking about? That's where the ICWA Advisory Board, 11 tribes, we all get together and we advise the commissioner on kind of what they should be doing for the ICWA and MIFPA laws and kind of going that route. And there's also the MIAC, Minnesota Indian Advisory Council, which that's all the tribal chairs where they get together and they do recommendations too. So that's some of the funding that we do with that.
Great, thank you. All right, well, thank you to our panelists so much. I wish you were here in person because we're starting to get the smells of lunch in the room and folks are hungry. So we're going to break here for lunch. I just so appreciate you all joining us and sharing your expertise and data. So thank you for being here. Miigwech. Okay.
Yeah, perfect, great. Nanetu Gerald Clark. My name is Gerald Clark. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Kuya Band of Indians, and I'm a visual artist, and my daughter and I are going to present some creative work for you today.
Emily Clark, Pindahin, Kuyanka. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily, and I'm from the Kuya Reservation. I am primarily a poet. I'm also a recent graduate of the University of California, Riverside, as well. Thank you. As well as a bead artist and a traditional dancer. So we're here today to share some of our work with you. And I want to thank you all for being willing to share your lunch break with us. And I'll turn it back over to my dad.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Emily just graduated Sunday night, so we're still getting caught up from that. Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about creativity. I know you guys have been talking about some heavy things, and it's much appreciated within our tribal communities. We thought we'd share a little bit. All of you already know about intergenerational trauma and the things that have impacted our people in our communities. And so art and poetry, I think, is a great way of healing from those things. And so we're just going to share some of our work with you today. This is one of my sculptures, and oftentimes people ask me, like when they find out I'm an artist, like, what do you do? What's your thing? And my answer is always kitchen sink. It's anything I can get my hands on, I try to make art of. And so this is one of my wall sculptures. And I think, does anybody recognize what's presented on the screen there? Does it look familiar to anybody? If you're a member of a Southern California tribe or in the region, you probably recognize this as our traditional gambling game that we've played for hundreds of years, if not longer, called Peon, which is a game that's played at night. And so I made the sculpture in honor of our Peon players and this long tradition that we have, community gatherings and things like that. And one of the reasons I made this work is because oftentimes when I show this in a gallery or museum, people think it's like surrealism. People think it's like some kind of fantasy, right? Or maybe they're just really poor and cold and they're sleeping in the same bed together. And yet when I show this to our local tribal communities, oh, it might as well be a basket of fruit. It's so familiar because it's part of our culture. And so a lot of times I try to make artwork that's very much based within the culture, right? And it's not necessarily meant to teach non-natives, it's celebrating who we are as California Indian people, and particularly here in Southern California. This is one of my paintings. This is entitled Survivance. And for those of you, it's a related term, survivance, to survival. Social theorist from the Anishinaabe tribe, Gerald Wisner, he came up with this concept of survivance, which is what all of our communities are in now. We're not just surviving, surviving has become our way of life because of colonization, right? And the threats to our traditional culture. And so we're all in a state of survivance these days. This is this concept. And so I hear you had bird singing yesterday morning. I think you're going to have some more this afternoon and tomorrow. And so this practice of bird singing, that's part of our traditional culture. And you learn the songs, that's part of our oral tradition. And so the featuring the rattles there is just, as a Kuya artist, and oftentimes artists talk about self-expression and things like that. I often talk about obligation and I talk about responsibility as a native artist back to my community. And so by including the bird singing rattles there, this is part of our culture, right? And it's important that artists represent our communities within our work. I'll point out the shapes of California, which we predate the state of California, obviously, right? The heartbeat rhythm sign in the background, and then the acorns across the top, right? They say at the time of contact with the Europeans, 70% of all California Indians ate acorn on a daily basis. And I noticed Pechanga's seal that was on the screen earlier actually had "We Wish," and they had the acorn on their seal. And this is something that we continue to do and to gather as part of our traditional culture. For those of you who are familiar with the arts of California Indian tribes, basketry is celebrated globally. Here in California, the basket makers are the amazing artists of our times, and they've gone back for generations. And basketry is not really a celebrated art within the European or American tradition, but this is our traditional art form. And it was primarily, in the Kuya sense, it was primarily women who carried that tradition on. And you couldn't simply be a craftsperson when you made a basket. You had to know the plants. You had to know where they grew, how they grew, when to collect those plants. So you had to be a botanist. Then when you start combining these materials in a meaningful way, you had to understand our culture. You had to understand our cosmology. And so basket makers were really the amazing artists / philosophers / scientists of our communities. And so I myself do not make baskets because in the Kuya sense, that was primarily a gendered art. It was led by women, but I do make sculpture based on our basketry tradition. And I was asked to do a sculpture for the Palm Springs Art Museum. And this was my sketch for the basket that I was going to make, a basket sculpture. And if I go back, you see the flower, the 5-pointed flower that's on the image to your left. And then you see the kind of triangular designs of the basket on the right. So I incorporated both those traditional Kuya baskets into my design here. And then I created this sculpture based on that sketch. And this is made out of 1,834 crushed aluminum beer and soda cans. And I used the color of the cans and I glue them down into it. That's 8 feet across. So it's a large wall sculpture. And it's celebrating, I call it the continuum basket because it's celebrating our basketry tradition, but it's doing a couple other things. The fact that I use soda cans is not an accident. Because of our instance of diabetes within our communities, I have to acknowledge that. There's also plenty of beer cans in this sculpture. And you all know already, right, that alcoholism within our communities is another issue that we deal with. And I never, America has romanticized our culture enough, and I never want to be accused of romanticizing my own culture. And I want to, best way to say it is, I want to keep it real, right? And I'm part of my community. I'm right in my community. My studio is part of my community. And so I like this work because it brings some of those things that we're dealing with, but ultimately you get back and it's kind of a beautiful thing. People view it from far off and they, oh, wow. And then get closer and like, oh, that's just cans. And I like that. I like what happens there. And it's a matter of just using everyday objects and things like that in my work. And now I'm going to turn it over to my daughter, Emily.
All right, hello. So the pictures here, I mentioned I'm also a beadwork artist, so that's some of my work, as well as a picture of the logo of a literary magazine that I am co-editor for, that I created during my time at UCR. So that's just some things. You can follow me on Instagram at Kuya Woman, and I have all of my work as well as my beadwork and any of the performances that I am going to do. So I'm going to share a poem with you today that I wrote about the concept of home, When I think about my dad's work and when I think about the things you are discussing at this conference, I think about home. And so that's what I wrote on today. When someone asks me what my home is like, I say, haven't you ever wondered where the roadrunners get all their luck? My home is like the smell of foil wrapped meat being pulled from the earth by dirty brown hands. My home is as warm as the coals of a fire, surrounded by rattles crashing like ocean waves. My home is like the white sage that sprouts from the same earth ancestors' ashes were scattered on. My home is soft like the fry bread dough aunties take turns mixing before a burial. When someone asks me what my home is like, I say my home is not the home of victims, but of survivors. My home is not the crossroads between genocide and erasure. My home is not the final resting place for a people who grieve themselves. My home is on the back of the hummingbird, in the center of a pale tobacco flower, amidst the cloud of dust billowing behind each old reservation truck, like a ribbon skirt caught in the wind. When someone asks me what my home is like, I say, have you ever had a dream that you were falling? My home is where you want to land. Achima.
And so that's our little short presentation for you. Really appreciate the work that you do. In Kauai, we don't really have a word for thank you because being generosity was the expectation, not something extra. So we do say achama is our word for good that we tend to use now for thank you. So achama pe'ipachim kal. It's good that we were gathered here today to have this moment together. Thank you for this time. Thank you for your attention. Enjoy your lunch. And again, thank you for the important work that you do.